Zorian slowly awoke in his bed in Siren. His head was fuzzy, his body hurt all over and he had trouble remembering what he had been doing in the previous restart. Confused and in pain, he remained lying in bed for a time, fading in and out of consciousness. Gradually, his mind began to clear up and he started to get concerned. Something was wrong. Yeah, he was feeling absolutely terrible, but it was more than that. Something was subtly off about this situation, and it was really starting to bother him. Oh, right, it suddenly dawned on him. Kiriel didn't wake me up by jumping on me. I woke up on my own with no one else in sight. That shouldn't be possible unless something has gone very, very wrong. The moment he realized this, it was as if something clicked inside his mind and it all came back to him. The sudden visit of Quatakekal, the theft of the dagger from the royal vaults with his help, the final battle they had against the ancient Lich and the insidious soul attack he used just before the restart ended. The memories flooded into his mind suddenly and without end. The process was forceful and alien, as if something was shoving these thoughts directly into his brain with little regard to his well-being. The waves of pain and nausea radiating from his damaged soul suddenly intensified, and he barely managed to roll himself out of bed before vomiting his guts out all over the floor of his room. Dimly, he was aware that Kiriel rushed inside when he started making noise and then rushed back out screaming for Mother to come and help, but he was in no position to react to that. It took all of his strength just to remain conscious and weather the pain. His soul felt like it was going to split apart, and he instinctively knew that. It would be a terrible mistake for him to black out at the moment. He and Zack had long theorized that their soul synchronized somehow with their body at the start of every restart, interfacing with their life force and rearranging their brains to account for the memories they gathered over the restarts, and it looked as if this was true except that in its current state, it was no longer capable of smoothly completing that process. Without Zorian's conscious efforts to stabilize his soul, it would not only ravage his body and mind but possibly also injure itself further in its fumbling. If he lost consciousness now, who knew when he was going to wake up next? A small, panicked part of his mind feared he had already spent the majority of their remaining restarts in a soul damage-induced coma, but he shoved that thought aside for now. This wasn't the time to worry about that. For now, all he could do was grit his teeth and deal with the problem at hand. He didn't know how much time he spent in that state, shivering on the floor of his room as he fought to stay awake, but eventually Mother and Kiriel rolled him over onto a blanket and carried him off to a guest room to recover in. Somehow, he managed to persist through it all until his soul finally calmed down. When he finally recovered enough to talk, he found out that it was still the first day of the restart. He had failed to react when Kiriel came to wake him up, and stayed that way for about 2 hours before waking up. Mother and Kiriel seemed shaken at the severity of his apparent illness, and refused to let him get up and walk around on his own in the aftermath. They also called for a local healer to come and check up on him, which was very annoying yet perfectly reasonable in light of what happened, so he could hardly object to it. Predictably, the healer failed to find anything really wrong with him. He was not a mage, just a local who knew how to recognize common illnesses and hand out appropriate potions in response. He failed to find anything seriously wrong with Zorian, so he simply suggested that they watch him closely for a few days to make sure it didn't happen again. Mother was rather unhappy with his uselessness, but she did seem more at ease after receiving the diagnosis. When they finally left him alone for a while, he decided to chance things and reached into his marker, even though he knew the action would aggravate his soul damage somewhat. He had to know how many restarts they still had left. The marker told him he still had 25 iterations left, which caused Zorian to breathe a sigh of relief. He didn't lose any of the restarts, it seemed. Zorian suddenly realized that he relied on his magic for practically everything these days. He had already forgotten what it was like to be a weak, mundane teenager. Even coming up with a plan for going forward that didn't involve the use of a teleport spell was hard. Damn it. He doubted Zack was any better off than he was, considering he had yet to visit Zorian after so many hours into the restart, so this was pretty much a total disaster. Even though they hadn't spent any of the restarts in a coma, the inability to use magic was going to sharply limit their options in the upcoming restarts. There was no way they would dare approach Silver Lake or Quatakikl with an obviously damaged soul like this, for instance. Additionally, the ancient Lich may be able to recognize the soul damage as having been done by himself in some fashion. Zorian had no idea how one would go about doing that, as he found no traces of foreign soul fragments in his soul, but he wasn't a millennia-old Lich like Quatakikl. He sighed. He had really underestimated the ancient Lich. He probably should have been raging internally at the amount of grief he caused them, but in all honesty, Zorian found himself kind of impressed by the decisiveness and ruthlessness Quatakikl had displayed. It took mere moments for Quatakikl to decide, after seeing Svim's memories, that the time loop was real and that he should sacrifice everything to hit them where it hurt the most. Most people would be doubtful at the information they received or too shocked to think clearly, but Quatakikl didn't hesitate at all to sacrifice his own soul in an attempt to take them down. Zorian could see the logic. Without Zack and Zorian mucking things up, Quatakikl was pretty much guaranteed to get what he wanted out of the invasion of Scioria, and potentially cooperating with them had little appeal to him. Possibility of betrayal aside, he was a 1,000-year-old Lich. What use did he have for a measly decade or two? Still, knowing all of this intellectually, and being able to disregard self-preservation in order to pull off a suicide move, those were two entirely different things. Zorian had no idea that a person could detonate the outer layer of one's soul in order to launch a massive suicide attack on the souls of everyone in the vicinity, but even if he did, he would not have expected Quatakikl to use such a maneuver after less than a minute of consideration. Zorian knew that he would be unable to act so boldly if he had found himself in Quatakikl's shoes, and it boggled his mind that a Lich people that are typically obsessed with personal survival at all costs was able to steel himself into pulling off a suicide move so easily. Well, putting that aside, he suddenly realized he had a tricky problem on his hands. Namely, he had to find a way to convince Mother to let him go to Scioria so he could check up on Zack. From what he remembered, the last time he failed to wake up in time, it was due to the sword diver attack in one of the restarts, and he had to remain in Siren for the rest of the month to make Mother calm down and let him out of her sight. This time the situation looked much worse, and he needed to convince her to trust him far more than she had been willing to the last time around. He could already feel his headache getting worse. It took 2 whole days of constant nagging and arguments before Zorian was able to convince Mother to let him go. He thought about just boarding a train when she wasn't looking, but the look in her eyes made him suspect she would drop everything and follow after him if he tried that. She could be remarkably stubborn that way. Strangely, it was Father who ended up helping him by arguing in his favor. He actually seemed impressed that Zorian was willing to push through his sickness and keep attending classes, and ended up helping him convince Mother to let him go to Scioria. It was a very surreal experience to Zorian, since he couldn't remember the last time his father took his side or approved of his choices. He didn't know how to feel about that. In any case, Mother eventually relented on the whole issue, though she did insist he take Kiriel with him. So she could keep an eye on him, supposedly. It was amusing to see her pause in surprise when he immediately agreed to her request. The journey was a bit of an unpleasant shock to him. Robbed of his magic and still plagued with phantom pains and tremors, he struggled to carry their luggage, and they both ended up getting caught in the rain for a while before they sought shelter in a nearby inn. He ended up renting a tiny, overpriced room for a single night, since the rain wouldn't be stopping anytime soon. Being unable to access his vast magic abilities was an unusual and very unpleasant experience. The next day, he brought Kiriel to Amaya's place. Thankfully, she did not make too much of an issue out of their arrival, even though Zorian had not arranged for anything with Ilsa in this particular restart. Then he went searching for Zack. He quickly realized this wouldn't be as easy as he imagined. Zack was, he soon found out, officially missing. Tezin's Very, Zack's legal guardian, was organizing a search for him and called for anyone who had any information about his whereabouts to contact him immediately. That was very familiar. Almost nostalgic, really. It was pretty much the same situation that he had faced during the first few restarts after he got pulled into the time loop. He wondered what that meant. Was this some kind of additional time loop safeguard that kept the controller gone until they recovered, or was this just Zack's guardian freaking out about finding a comatose Zack and faking a disappearance? Personally, Zorian would bet on the latter. Quite a few people apparently knew how inappropriate Tezen's handling of Novita's affairs was, so if Zack were to fall mysteriously unconscious all of a sudden, he would be one of the prime suspects. Zorian could totally see Tezen fearing that the coma would be blamed on him and faking a disappearance until he can decide what to do, much like Jornak did with Veyers. In any case, it was relatively easy to prove which one of the options was correct. Zack and Zorian both had a marker with an identical key, and Zorian knew a tracking ritual that would let him locate his fellow time traveler with ease. All he had to do now was find someone to help him cast it. Because he was currently incapable of doing it himself. Gods, he hated this restart so much. The room was silent. Zorian was supremely calm and collected, staring Svim right in the eyes despite the look of annoyance present on his mentor's face. "So let me see if I got you correctly," Svim said. "You are a time traveler, you fought a millennia-old Lich with Zack in the previous version of this month that I can't remember. Your soul has been damaged so you conveniently can't demonstrate any of this amazing magic you apparently know, and now you want me to help you rescue Zack from the evil clutches of Tezen, his legal guardian who is secretly behind his recent disappearance, despite organizing a nationwide search for the kid." Zorian considered it for a second. "Yes, that's pretty much what I'm saying," he nodded. "Get out of my office." Ilsa carefully studied the stack of papers in front of her, one hand propping up her chin while using the other to slowly tap her finger against the desk in a steady rhythm. Zorian patiently waited for her to finish reading. If this didn't work, he would have to take a risk and seek magical assistance through black market channels. Dealing with criminals while being essentially powerless was taking quite a bit of a risk, but there was nothing he could do. He needed to know what was going on with Zack. "So all I need to do is cast this spell on you and tell you what the results say?" Ilsa eventually asked, giving him a suspicious look. "That's right," Zorian nodded. "It looks like a tracking spell," she noted. "It is a tracking spell," Zorian confirmed. Ilsa raised an eyebrow at him. "Dare I ask what it's supposed to track, then?" she asked. "It's kind of personal," Zorian said, doing his best to look depressed and desperate. "I'm afraid my friend has gone missing. Please, Miss Salady. You know I'm not a troublemaker student and I don't ask for much. It would mean a world to me if you did this for me." Ilsa snorted derisively at him. "Humph. You need to work on your acting skills, Mr. Kaczynski," she told him. "That aside, I had Professor Chow tell me about a strange little visit from you recently." Ugh. He was still kind of annoyed that Svim was so unwilling to entertain his claims. Being implausibly good at magic was apparently really important for convincing the man there was something to his crazy time-traveling claims. Well, convincing him quickly, in any case. He could probably wear down the man's skepticism with a lot of time and effort, but he didn't want to wait that long to tackle this problem. "Is this friend of yours Zack Novita, perhaps?" Ilsa tried after he didn't say anything for a while. "He could be," Zorian shrugged. Ilsa sighed, folding her fingers into a triangle in front of her. "Putting aside that I have never really heard of you interacting much with Mr. Novita in the past, what if you're right? What if Zack has really been kidnapped by his caretaker and taken somewhere? I cast the tracking spell and give you the location. What do you do with it? How can an academy student like you handle the guards and the security measures that this place would undoubtedly have and rescue Zack?" Zorian internally debated the merits of explaining to her that his plan was to simply hire black market mercenaries to do the parts he himself could not, but eventually decided it was a bad idea. He had no real excuses in regards to where he got all the money needed to hire such people or why he thought he could judge their skills and character well enough to identify which of them are worth hiring and which aren't. "You don't have to worry about it, he told her, giving her a reassuring smile. I'm just trying to find a friend. I'm sure it won't be all that difficult. She gave him an unamused look. Yeah, he probably should have just gone to the black market right from the start instead of bothering with this. Contrary to his expectations, though, she didn't just throw him out of her office immediately after. Give me 2 days, okay, she eventually told him. I need to speak with the academy leadership about this. Huh? Zorian said, surprised. I'm not sure I understand. Why would you need to kick this up so high? It's just a tracking spell. And let you get in over your head and disappear as well. I don't think so, Ilsa said. If we're going to do this, we may as well go all the way. Besides, Mr. Novita is a student of our institution. It is well within our rights to try and locate him if he goes missing. She pushed the stack of papers towards him and tapped it a couple of times for emphasis. Now, she said, explain to me how exactly this tracking spell works and why you think it can find Mr. Novita when so many professional diviners have tried and failed to do the same. It was fascinating to watch how quickly and effectively the Academy could mobilize itself when it really cared about something. Perhaps it was because the House Novita had some secret ally among the Academy leadership, or because the Academy saw the whole situation as a chance to score some free reputation points, but they really did assemble a team to go check up on the location Zorian would provide them with. He'd be lying if he said he wasn't a little intimidated by the attention suddenly directed at him. For one thing, he wasn't actually completely certain the tracking spell would work. While he personally didn't think it very likely, it was still possible that Zack's disappearance was really just some sort of time loop safeguard and that he was literally nowhere to be found. It would be quite awkward if that happened. Zack was in a soul damage-induced coma, just like Zorian expected him to be. Due to his inability to cast anything, including soul diagnosis spells, he couldn't be sure why Zack had ended up in a worse state than he did, but he had his suspicions. Zack's control over his own soul was much weaker and cruder than Zorian's, as was his ability to retain mental discipline. If he woke up early on in the restart like Zorian did and had to fight to stay awake and prevent his soul from going berserk. Well, even Zorian found that struggle to be a challenging one. In any case, Zorian was now presented with a new problem. Even though he had been crucial in tracking down Zack, he now couldn't access his unconscious body at all. The discovery of his unconscious body had kicked up a media storm that didn't look like it was going to die down any time soon, and he had been transferred to an expensive hospital and placed under guard. Zorian was not a family member, nor did he have any other known links to the Novita heir, and many people were suddenly questioning his involvement in all this. The Academy was taking his side for now, but Ilsa told him things were a bit delicate at the moment. Tezen was trying to distance himself from the matter, bitterly denying he had anything to do with Zack's coma or imprisonment outside of Scioria, and his faction pushing hard for Zorian to be arrested so he could be vigorously questioned. No matter. Even if Zorian could see Zack, what would he do with his unconscious body? Before he visited Zack in the hospital, he had to figure out how to accelerate his healing. Who knew how long it would take for Zack to wake up if he had to rely on his natural rate of recovery? Fortunately, this was something he could actually tackle with his current abilities. Sudamir, just like many necromancers, often ended up damaging his soul in various ways while training and practicing his craft. As such, he had invested a lot of time in tracking down methods of accelerating his recovery, and Zorian had made sure to steal most of these out of his head during their interrogation sessions. A lot of these were purely personal soul magic exercises that were useful only to the soul mage using them, or complex ritual spells that he wasn't capable of casting right now, but a few actually came in the form of potions that could be administered to others. And alchemy did not require any mana shaping. His inability to do magic did not hold him back here in the slightest. So long as he could track down and buy the appropriate materials, he would be able to create the potions in question. Getting materials for such a relatively exotic potion was anything but easy, of course. Many of them were not sold on the open market, and even if they were Zorian did not have enough money on him to buy them. He thought about robbing invader caches again, but his lack of magic made that a far riskier proposition than it usually was. Additionally, he had attracted quite a bit of attention to himself lately, so going out for a little midnight stealing was probably unwise. Thus, he ended up amassing the necessary funds the hard way. He bought a bunch of raw materials with his available money, made a handful of rare, hard-to-make potions with them, sold them for money, used that money to buy even more raw materials, and so on. It took him a week of that to get enough money to buy what he actually wanted, and then another 4 days before he had managed to track it all down and finished the potions. The end result was 3 different bottles, one holding a milky white liquid, another a blood-red syrup that looked as if it was constantly boiling, and the last one a glossy, pitch-black pill that floated in the center of the bottle as if weightless. He took all 3 of them and departed in the direction of the hospital that held Zack. He was still not allowed to visit him, but who cared about that? Through a strategic use of sleep bombs and other disabling potions, he managed to gain access to Zack's room, after which he proceeded to force-feed the 3 soul cures to his unconscious body, one after another. He immediately left afterwards. It would take a while for the potions to actually take effect, and it would be best if he were far away from the scene of the crime when people found the trail of unconscious bodies he had left in his wake. The news of the second attack on Zack while he was in the hospital kicked up another round of controversy and several dramatic vows by the hospital staff and city authorities that the perpetrator was going to be caught any day now. Considering that not even Zorian's worst detractors seemed to suspect him as the perpetrator made him rather doubtful of that claim, though. One amusing detail was that the hospital claimed they had caught the attacker in the act and heroically fought him off, which was why Zack supposedly hadn't been hurt more as a result of the break-in. While he waited to see what the result of his intervention would turn out to be, Zorian looked into what had happened to Alanik, since the battle priest was one of the few competent and reliable soul mages he knew of. Sadly, with Zorian being unable to teleport and busy with the whole Zack situation, he never did intervene to save Alanik from Sudamir's assassins, so by the time he checked up on him the man was already dead. Frustrating. It did make him kind of curious how those assassins were even capable of killing someone of Alanik's caliber. Investigating the case a little revealed he was essentially ambushed while sleeping, allowing his attackers to kill him before he even realized what was going on. That kind of made sense, yeah. If Zorian saved Lukav, Sudamir panicked and acted prematurely, trying to kill Alanik through sheer force before Lukav could contact him and tell him someone was killing people like them. If the assassination of Lukav went through without issues, Sudamir would act with due caution and planning and kill Alanik in his sleep. In any case, the treatment worked far better than he had hoped. 4 days after he fed Zack those potions, his fellow time traveler woke up from the coma. Not long after that, he demanded to see Zorian, which pretty much shut down any further attempts to keep Zorian from visiting the hospital. "How are you feeling?" Zorian asked his fellow time traveler. "You know our conversation is probably being eavesdropped, right?" Zorian asked him. "So? Just put up a privacy ward on the room and be done with it," Zack told him. "I can't," Zorian sighed. "I can't really cast anything right now." Zack was quiet for a few seconds. "Ah," he said finally. "I guess you didn't get off as lightly as it appears. You probably don't want to hear this, but that kind of makes me glad. I kind of prefer it when you have to suffer through this crap with me." "Jerk," Zorian said, though there was no real heat in it. Yeah, but seriously, why are you already walking around while I can't even stand up without vomiting all over myself?" "I'm not sure, but do you perhaps remember waking up in your own room for a moment before losing consciousness again?" Zorian asked him. Zack frowned. "It's hard to remember," he said after a few seconds. "Maybe. Well, we're going to have to continue this particular topic when you get out of the hospital," Zorian told him. "Can you estimate how long it will be before you're back in top form?" Zack frowned. "I don't know. 4, 5 months. Something like that." Zorian breathed a sigh of relief. Although Zack's condition was worse than his own, it would seem it still wasn't too bad. Is there something urgent you need right now? Zorian asked him. As you can imagine, my ability to acquire things is a bit limited at the moment, but I'll do my best. All I want right now is to be out of this damn hospital, Zack grumbled. But I don't think that's going to happen before the end of the month, considering what I've overheard, and neither of us has the ability to force the issue right now. It was as Zack said. He spent the rest of the restart trapped in the hospital while Zorian had to dodge increasingly insistent questions about his involvement in the Zack affair and his personal activities. Thankfully, before those things could really get anywhere, the summer festival had arrived and the restart came to an end. The next 5 restarts were relatively relaxed. With their souls so heavily damaged and their spellcasting impaired, Zack and Zorian couldn't really do anything particularly dangerous or strenuous, lest their recovery be prolonged even further or their soul damage become permanent. Whether it was Zack or Zorian, they had no choice but to patiently wait for their souls to heal, so they gave up on doing anything serious and decided to just have fun and work on some of their easier skills. A part of Zorian was aghast at taking a break with their time steadily running out as it was, but forcing themselves would gain them little while risking a lot, so he did his best to suppress it. Unexpectedly, having his soul damaged actually ended up being quite a boon to Zorian's skill with soul perception and soul magic in general. It allowed him to map out his soul in far greater detail and enhanced his understanding of how souls generally functioned. There were some things that were very hard to notice when things were going smoothly, and some pieces of the soul were far easier to comprehend when one compared intact and damaged versions of the soul to one another. He knew from reading Sudamir's mind that necromancers often deliberately mutilated other people's souls for that exact reason, destructively studying the anatomy of the soul to enhance their own skills, but one could never really perceive foreign souls on the same level of detail as one could perceive their own. As far as Zorian knew, no soul mage was crazy enough to deliberately damage their own soul as heavily as Zack and Zorian had gotten theirs damaged just to enhance their knowledge of soul mechanics, so their current opportunity was somewhat unique. Although Zack started from a lower level, his skill in regards to personal soul perception also grew by leaps and bounds in this period, since he invested a huge amount of effort into it, much more than Zorian himself. The fact that he had ended up worse in the wake of Quatakikle's soul attack seemed to have affected him greatly. Aside from soul magic, the two of them also worked on their basic shaping skills and tinkered rather heavily with alchemy, since this was the one magical discipline that hadn't been affected by their injuries in the slightest. They didn't try to inform anyone of the time loop during this time. Most of the notebooks and other gathered information had been stored in the palace orb, which they couldn't actually access at the moment. They still interacted with many of the people they previously worked with, but mostly for the sake of fun and hanging out this time. They spent an entire restart diligently going to class, being as helpful as humanly possible to every teacher and student they encountered. They spent a restart shape-shifting into various animals through transformation potions and explored the city and its surroundings through alien senses and perspectives. They dabbled in painting, sculpting, wood carving, drawing and various art skills. They went on a tour of Eldamar and its neighbors via train and other mundane methods. And when the last of these relaxing restarts was drawing to a close, Zorian realized he wasn't sorry for it at all. Even though they kind of wasted their time, even though they would only have 19 iterations left once this restart was finished, he was at peace with it all. We really need to give it our all in the upcoming restarts, Zorian said to Zack one day. 19 restarts aren't that much and we never know when something like this can happen again. If we had gotten this injured with only a handful of restarts left, that would have been the end of us right there. Do you think we should still mess around with Quatakikle after this? Hell yes, Zack said firmly. I mean, yeah, he really got us good this time, but we still haven't figured out a good way to break into the royal vaults without his help. And besides, while he ended up messing us up, he also showed us a really good way of taking him down with relative ease. Oh? Zorian asked curiously. And what would that be? See, I think we've been overthinking things a little, Zack explained. Instead of trying to lure Quatakikl into a trap and flooding him with golems and enemy mages, we should be relying on our strengths to defeat him. Well, your strengths in this case. I'm talking about mind magic, of course. Mind magic? Zorian said, stunned. But with his mind blank on. Svim also had his mind blank on and it didn't stop Quatakikl, Zack quickly pointed out. It would be tricky, but if we time things right and I get a moment to concentrate properly, I'm pretty sure I can hit the guy with a powerful enough dispel to get rid of his mind blank. Just for a moment, but that should be enough for you, right? I'm quite sure that Quatakikl has some measure of skill with defending his mind, Zorian said carefully. The fact he was able to search Svim's mind so quickly in the heat of battle shows he's quite proficient in mind magic. Still, I don't think he's psychic, and the brief telepathic clash I had with him didn't impress me much. I suppose it could work. It will work, Zack insisted. Your mind magic is terrifying, and I bet it has been centuries since Quatakikl has been targeted by a mind mage he couldn't kill in under a second. So long as we can stop Quatakikl from murdering you before you finish subverting his mind, I think this could work amazingly well. You say that like it's such an easy thing, Zorian sighed. But you're right, that is an interesting idea. Certainly better than fumbling wildly for a solution like we have been doing thus far. I kind of suspect Quatakikl has rigged his soul to be withdrawn back into his phylactery if his mental defenses are ever seriously breached, though. That's what I'd do in his place. That still means we get to pick up the imperial crown from his abandoned skeleton, though, Zack said with a shrug. That's the only thing we truly need from him. Everything else is just a bonus. Zorian supposed he was right about that. The next restart they decided to spring back to work and get their plans back on track. Their souls were fully healed as far as they could figure out, and they didn't have too much time to waste. Thus, they quickly established a simulacrum link to Koth and Zlotic, recovered the palace orb, stole the Pearl of Aranhal, and then boarded their brand new airship and set off towards Blantyr. It would be a long and dangerous journey. Blantyr was the largest of the world's continents, but it was separated by miles and miles of open sea from the nearest human port. Just making sure they stayed on the right path was a problem, since the endless expanse of water provided few clues as to whether or not they were going the right way, and neither Zack nor Zorian were proficient in this kind of navigation. On top of that, the shortest path to the continent, which they pretty much had to take, passed uncomfortably close to a large island inhabited by dragons, hundreds upon hundreds of dragons. It was called, somewhat unimaginatively but accurately, Dragon Island. Dragons generally weren't fond of humanity, and the dragons of the so-called Dragon Island were especially belligerent. They not only killed any human that tried to disembark on the island itself, but actively patrolled the waters around it for any passing ships. If they spotted any, they demanded ruinous tributes in exchange for not destroying the vessel. Zack and Zorian had asked around to see what the dragons found fitting to their tastes and were prepared to pay the tribute for their safe passage, but the airship was very eye-catching and dragons were known to be capricious at the best of times. It was best to prepare for a fight just in case, and a dragon was always a headache to fight. On top of that, some of the sea monsters were known to be able to attack aerial vessels, firing jets of water and energy attacks at things flying above them. It didn't happen often, and the Pearl of Aranhal usually flew quite high in the air, but it meant that Zack and Zorian could never fully relax and had to be constantly on the lookout for potential problems. Still, things were finally moving again, and that was the important part. They would make the attempt at the dagger and the crown again in this restart, and they would lay down the groundwork for finding the location of the staff as well. In the meantime, they were about to establish contact with Quatakikl again. It was time to arrange for a trade. Zorian would be lying if he said that interacting with Quatakikl again didn't fill him with dread. Aside from the fact that the ancient Lich had reached an unfathomable level of expertise in soul magic and could possibly detect residual damage on their souls, their current trade offer was fundamentally different from what they did during their last interaction with him. Before, it was Quatakikl who approached them. Last time, he had blindsided them with his sudden visit. He had the initiative right from the start, which doubtlessly helped lessen the level of threat he felt from them. This time, it would be them who were going to blindside him, and Zorian was not at all sure the ancient Lich could take that gracefully. Yet, Zorian knew he had to risk it. The fact was, their current initiatives were insufficient. Even if they managed to gather all the keys together in one restart before the time ran out, that wouldn't be enough. Not for Zorian, anyway. The problem of how he was supposed to exit the time loop still remained. His original self was still out there in the real world, so he couldn't just order the Guardian of the Threshold to shove his soul into his real body and be done with it. The Guardian of the Threshold may be confused about his controller status, but it would surely notice there was already a soul in Zorian's original body upon trying that. And even if that could be sidestepped somehow, there was still the matter of how to seize control of the body from his original self. Zorian had a couple of ideas on how he could leave the time loop despite this issue, but all of them required incredibly advanced knowledge of dimensionalism and soul magic to accomplish. Quadakikl had both, and it was likely that the insights he had into those two fields were impossible to find elsewhere. Zorian couldn't afford to ignore this priceless source of information, no matter how dangerous it was. Arranging a meeting with the ancient Lich proved to be rather simple, at least. All they had to do was go to the same corner store that Quadakikl had sent them to the last time they had interacted with him and ask about him. The man behind the counter acted as if they were crazy, but not long after they left, the cephalic rat suddenly became a lot more interested in them and started following them around. Zorian simply kept stealing away the individual rats from the collective for a few days before Quadakikl decided to contact them personally and arranged for a meeting. At the moment, Zack, Zorian and Quadakikl were sitting in a private booth of a relatively high-class restaurant near the city center. Not exactly the type of institution Zorian liked to frequent, in part because just getting a seat in one of those was pretty hard for an unknown teenager like him, but Quadakikl had been the one to pick the location and he was evidently in the mood to show off his wealth and influence. He was using the same face and flesh and blood look he did the last time they met in a public location. Either this appearance was his usual persona for dealing with people, or this was how he once looked before discarding his flesh for an undead existence. "What an interesting offer," Quadakikl said, playing around with his fork thoughtfully, occasionally tapping it against his glass. He had ordered an expensive meal and wine for the occasion, but did not touch any of it throughout the entire meeting. "I'm no stranger to people seeking me out for my wealth of magical secrets, but usually their offers are hesitant. They're leery of angering a powerful Lich, they aren't sure if I am really as good as they heard, and they're trying to pay as little as possible to get what they want. They start small, asking for relatively minor things in order to puzzle out how I think and what it would take to get what they really want." The ancient Lich then made a dramatic pause, pointing at the small pile of divine artifacts and rare materials that Zack and Zorian brought to him as payment for his wealth of magical secrets, as he put it. "You though?" Quadakikl continued. "You're immediately going for the kill. You want nothing less than my complete pocket dimension creation expertise and extremely rare, almost priceless set of secrets, and you're willing to offer no less than 5 divine artifacts and a plethora of extremely rare materials in return. I'm impressed by your boldness, but I can't help but wonder, are you not worried I will cheat you, or that this will end up a disappointing trade in the end? You are, after all, trading physical goods for information of uncertain value. I could easily just ignore you after pocketing the goods, or play dumb and give you mere shadow of what you asked for." Zorian mentally agreed with this, but wasn't really worried. Although many things about the ancient Lich were enigmatic, he was pretty sure he had a good read on his sense of honor. Quadakikl prided himself on his sense of fairness. He would not cheat them unless he thought they were trying to cheat him first. The real challenge was to make him agree to the deal in the first place. "Although I don't dare claim I know you, you are as famed for your honorable behavior as you are for your great magical skill and brutality in warfare," Zorian said. Quadakikl smiled idly, clearly viewing all 3 traits as a compliment. "We feel that if we can reach an agreement with you, you will do your best to honor it." Perhaps my knowledge of pocket dimensions isn't as extensive as you think it is, though, Quada pointed out. I am indeed a man of many talents, but that is quite a rare and exotic field of study. You may end up disappointed by the results of the trade. If so, we will accept it quietly and in good grace, Zorian shrugged. We're willing to take a gamble. Although it is not a smart thing to admit such a thing in these kinds of negotiations, I feel you are being a little too reckless here, Quada noted thoughtfully, giving them both a piercing look, as if trying to see through their souls. It would have been smarter to try and do a smaller trade at first just to see if my pocket dimension skills are worth the more substantial investment. Well, said Zack with a cheeky smile. Although this is generally not a smart thing to admit in these kinds of negotiations, the fact is we're in a bit of a hurry. Slowly feeling you out and haggling over the details would take too long. That's why the terms we offered you were so generous, see? Generous? Debatable, Quada scoffed. I was merely questioning your logic just now. I said nothing about how good the deal appears to me. What you are seeking is pretty damn valuable. Quada stared at them for a few seconds. Perhaps he was trying to put pressure on them through silence to see how they would react. You're pretty interesting people, Quada said. I think that's why I haven't simply told you to screw off by now. That's what I'd normally tell people if they tried to give me this kind of deal. Are you really teenagers? You are way too calm for people that are supposed to be, 15 years old. Why bother even asking? Zack challenged. We already know you've tried to spy on us before inviting us here, so you probably know enough about us to answer this yourself. I do know some basic facts about you too, Quada admitted. It's just that they don't make much sense. How the hell did 2 academy students gather all this and find out how to contact me? Who are you really? It's a secret, Zorian said blandly. There was no point in trying to explain. But since we're asking private questions about one another, let me ask you a question of my own. How exactly did you talk no less than 4 cephalic rat swarms into working under you? What the hell did you offer them to make them open to cooperation? I can't even get them to talk to me, much less work for me. Heh. Are we including that information as part of our deal? Quada asked with a grin. No, Zorian snorted derisively. I was just curious. And also changing the subject, Quada noted. But fine, I get it. If you want to keep your true identity secret, I won't pry. But you know, if you really are as young as you appear, then we have another problem on our hands. Namely, I'm not sure if you're even capable of learning how to perform dimensional magic on the level you are asking about. What makes you think you are qualified to learn from me? That is not an issue, Zorian insisted. We know we can perform this level of magic because we are already capable of creating pocket dimensions. Oh. Quada said, a little incredulously. Yes, Zorian confirmed. They would have to be careful not to make themselves look too amazing, or else Quada might notice something was wrong and attack them again. But this particular bit of information was impossible to hide, considering what they were asking of him. We are asking you for advanced guidance, not asking you to teach us the basics of the field. Zorian then removed a bracelet from his wrist and handed it to the ancient Lich, who gracelessly snatched it out of his outstretched hand and began to scrutinize it. The bracelet was something Zorian had personally created before coming here. It served as an anchor for a miniature pocket dimension. The internal space was tiny, barely enough to store a book or two, but that wasn't important. The important thing was that it proved that not only were they capable of creating pocket dimensions, they could create advanced ones. Most products of pocket dimension magic came in the form of boxes, chests, and other rigid containers that had their internal volume expanded beyond what their outside form would suggest. These kinds of objects were relatively easy to make, as anchoring a pocket dimension to an internal space of a hollow, inflexible object was a relatively simple task. Well, as much as any pocket dimension creation could ever be easy, anyway. A more advanced procedure was to use dimensional magic to expand the interior of more flexible containers like bags, backpacks, and pockets. Although this sounded rather convenient, fabric was relatively fragile and hard to imbue with spell formula. After a few years of use at most, such objects inevitably fell apart, sometimes causing catastrophic failures when least expected. Finally, there were objects like the palace orb and the bracelet that Quatakikl was currently holding. These objects were not containers with expanded interior at all. They were self-contained pocket worlds anchored to an object. Accessing the contents of such a self-contained space was tricky without dimensional magic, which drastically reduced the amount of people that could use them, but they were incredibly stable. They could be inflated to downright ridiculous sizes, if one had a sufficiently stable anchor object as the palace orb amply proved. The bracelet Zorian cobbled up in the last few days was pretty underwhelming in that regard, but he was sure that Quatakikl would recognize what it signified nevertheless. After a minute or so of silent study, Quatakikl handed the bracelet back to Zorian and then unceremoniously drew all the divine artifacts and exotic materials towards him with a sweep of his hand. After a few quick movements, they all disappeared into his pockets. Neither Zack nor Zorian moved to stop him. "All right," Quatakikl said with a small nod. "You win. I accept the deal. Since you have said you were in a hurry and I'm going to be busy with something soon, we can start tomorrow." Busy with something? What a funny way to hide the fact he was planning an invasion of the city and the release of the primordial trapped in the hole. Still, Zack and Zorian were pretending not to know about that in this restart, so they said nothing about that. After arranging for their next meeting place and hammering out some minor details, they turned to leave only for the Lich to stop them. "One more thing," Quatakikl said. "Who messed up your souls so badly?" Zorian couldn't help but jolt a little at the question. What?" he asked. "Your souls are scarred," Quatakikl said matter-of-factly. "The damage is faint now, and will probably go away completely in a few years, but less than a year ago you must have been in an absolutely miserable condition. A normal person would take years recovering from something like that. Much of it would be spent comatose, too. I guess I should add soul magic to the list of things you are inexplicably proficient in. Damn it." So he could detect it, though it didn't look like he recognized it as something inflicted by him in particular. "Does it matter?" Zack challenged. "No, I guess not," Quatakikl said, frowning. "But it makes me even more certain you are not really who you present yourself as. You are fortunate I have something else occupying my attention at the moment, or else I would not be as willing to let this go so easily. Make no mistake, though once I've cleared up my schedule a little, I'll come back to visit you so we can clear some things up." Zorian did not outwardly react to this proclamation, but inwardly he was breathing a sigh of relief. No doubt Quatakikl meant this as a veiled threat, but so long as nothing happened within the bounds of the time loop, Zorian didn't really care about that. Provided they didn't mess up in some other way as the restart developed, they should be fine. Hopefully Silver Lake would take his warnings not to investigate into Quatakikl more seriously this time around. Whether because Quatakikl didn't know that they were aware of the invasion this time around, or because he never discovered just how expansive their activities around the region really were, the Lich didn't seem to view them as very threatening this time around. They were kind of baffling, yes, but he had an invasion to organize and he had no idea he had a time limit when it came to figuring them out. In regards to his obligations, he fulfilled them to the letter. The agreement called for him to provide them with instructions for 2 hours every day, and he was never late for the arranged time, nor did he stay so much as 1 minute longer than they agreed. If he withheld some of his expertise, it was in a way that neither Zack nor Zorian could tell the difference. The amount of information he had for them was enough to keep them busy for quite a while. He spoke clearly and understandably. He readily clarified his statements if he saw they did not understand him. He pointed out any obvious mistakes they did under his supervision and explained the logic behind his instructions rather than let them figure things out for themselves. He never lost patience with them or insulted them. He was, strangely enough, probably the best teacher Zorian had ever encountered. Realizing that a soul-defiling, warmongering, thousand-year-old Lich was his ideal academic instructor was a somewhat unnerving realization for Zorian. That aside, having Quadikikle's dedicated help in understanding pocket dimension magic made Zorian suddenly aware that it wasn't just the lack of qualified teachers and instruction manuals that was holding him and Zack back from advancing quickly in the field. Embarrassingly enough, it often happened that Quadikikle was pushing ahead in his lessons and the two of them struggled to follow along. To put it bluntly, the real bottleneck to making the most out of those lessons was their own lack of talent and comprehension, not Quadikikle's unwillingness to instruct them to the best of his ability. Zorian had a feeling the ancient Lich was laughing at them on the inside about that. Zorian knew this kind of result was to be expected. It wasn't that Zack and Zorian were stupid, or that their work ethic was lacking, it was just that they lacked any special advantage when it came to learning something like pocket dimension magic. They had no special talent or bloodline related to the field. And neither of them was the kind of genius that could easily grasp the complexities of this relatively mind-bending, unintuitive field of study. There was little that could be done to speed their learning process up, at least through traditional methods of advancement. So Zorian turned to non-traditional methods instead. For a while now he had been hesitating about delving deeper into the field of mental enhancements he had been messing with, afraid that he would permanently mess up his own mind in the process. Now he decided to risk it and ordered his simulacrums to kick things up a few levels. Aware that time was steadily running out, they did not complain much and simply jumped at the task with enthusiasm that honestly surprised him. He supposed that since he himself had set aside his fears and resolved to tackle the issue, they inherited his determination as well, unlike in the past, where he himself had viewed the endeavor with apprehension, and thus his simulacrums had been similarly unenthused about risking themselves. For the moment, his idea was to try and create a sort of mental calculator and internal clock, since a lot of the problems with pocket dimensions came from the inhuman timing and precision required to pull off certain stages successfully. Normally this was achieved via a complex system of divination magic, which added an extra layer of complexity to an already tricky task. If he could strip away the divination scaffolding and just do all the number crunching, measurements and timing decisions purely in his head, the magic would get significantly easier. Of course, it turned out to be not that easy. While Zorian knew that creating a mental calculator was very much possible, since it was one of the more common modifications Urania tinkered with, it was a tricky thing to pull off in practice. Several of his simulacrum had to be forcibly broken out of their experiments after they fell into strange mental states, endlessly counting the number of pebbles around them and such. Thankfully, none of them were so far gone that they had to be destroyed and recreated, so they were able to learn from their mistakes instead of starting from scratch and trying to guess where their predecessors made a mistake. Additionally, he was also experimenting with hyper-focused mental states and with trying to replicate the Hydra's unity of self with his simulacrums. He had a feeling that if he could synchronize himself with a handful of his own simulacrums the way a Hydra could synchronize its multiple minds into one self, many complex pieces of magic would become relatively trivial to perform. Of course, these kind of mental enhancement were only of possible benefit to Zorian, and did not help Zack in any way. For this reason, and also because he wanted to hedge his bets, Zorian also started to look more closely into blood magic and enhancement rituals. After all, some creatures were innately good at dimensionalism in various forms. Phase spiders, for instance, were capable of instinctively creating small pocket dimensions to hide themselves in. Blink toads could teleport short distances, void soul deer could bend space around them to make spells and projectiles launched at them miss, and the silver-striped mole was rumored to be able to perceive dimensional cracks and boundaries in some strange fashion. It might be worthwhile to try and steal those kinds of abilities for a while, just to see if they could offer them with some kind of important insight or capability. Of course, Zorian was currently not very well versed in either blood magic or regular enhancement rituals, so he would first have to practice with something relatively simple and then slowly work his way up to what he wanted. Alternatively, he could just hire an alchemist to make him an enhancement potion with desired ability, but such enhancement potions did not confer the sort of instinctive competence with the gained ability that a properly executed enhancement ritual did. In any case, both the mental enhancement route and the blood magic route were long projects. It would be at least a couple of restarts before he could make an effective use of them, maybe more. Thus, Zorian ended up turning to something more immediate to get the most out of Quatakekle's teachings, his spell formula expertise. Zorian knew for a while now that most old, experienced diviners had specialized divination compasses they used to perform their work. Zorian himself rarely bothered with them, preferring to simply dump information straight into his mind and sort it out mentally, but he had tinkered with such devices often enough in the past. Kerma's divination flower thingy and the spell formula crafters she referred him to were especially useful in this regard. Now he embarked on a project to create such a divination compass, one specialized in figuring out divination related to dimensionalism and pocket dimension creation. In this, at least, he had plenty of success. Spell formula were one of the things he had focused on pretty heavily throughout his entire time in the time loop, and he had reached an extremely high level of skill when it came to them. Producing a working version of such a dimensionalism-specific divination compass took only 2 days, after which he rapidly improved the design, producing newer and more potent versions every couple of days. By the time the end of the restart was approaching, these divination compasses had become so good that Quatakekle took notice of it and commissioned a couple of them for his own use. In exchange, he provided them with the names and locations of 2 secretive mages that also knew a thing or two about pocket dimension magic, information that was almost as priceless as Quatakekle's own lessons, as far as Zack and Zorian were concerned. Gradually, the end of the restart started to approach. While trying to deepen their understanding of pocket dimension magic consumed most of their energies in this particular restart, it was far from being the only thing they worked on. An equally critical, though far more boring task was to make sure the Pearl of Aranhal reached Blantyre safe and intact. A mission that was thankfully far easier than they had ever hoped it would be. No sea monsters bothered them, and while no less than 3 dragons spotted them as they flew near the Dragon Island, they were surprisingly easy to keep at bay with flashy combat spells and a single experimental, magic-enhanced cannon that Zorian had installed on the ship. Neither the spells nor the cannon actually did any damage to the dragons in question, but they kept the beasts from simply rushing at them and ripping the hull into shreds. Perhaps because they had never seen an airship like theirs and did not know what combat abilities to expect from it, all 3 of the dragons limited themselves to probing attacks and flying in circles around them for a few hours to see if their response times and attentiveness would ever slip up. It helped that each of the dragons attacked alone. Only after one of the dragons had given up on bothering them would the next one try his luck. If all 3 of them had united against them, Pearl of Aranhal would have been doomed without question. Thankfully for them, dragons were notoriously solitary creatures that viewed their own kind largely as competition rather than kin. They lived and hunted alone, only forming societies if pressured to do so by outside aggression. Zorian had heard there had been a few ill-considered campaigns in the past that sought to systematically wipe out dragons in a particular area, only for the dragons in question to temporarily amass themselves into massive flocks that devastated everything around them for a while before eventually breaking up again when they were certain the danger was gone. Aside from that, dragons were largely an individual threat, and dragons of Dragon Island were no exception. Unfortunately, while their journey had not been delayed by dragons and sea monsters, their own lack of navigational skill had lengthened the journey somewhat. Additionally, while the people who made Pearl of Aranhal were world-class experts, it was still a prototype that had never really been tested or truly finished before being sent on such an ambitious journey, meaning that it had almost broken down several times along the way, almost crashing them into the sea at one point and forcing them to drastically slow down at several points along their chosen route. But in the end they made it. 5 days before the restart was about to end, the Pearl of Aranhal finally spotted the shores of Blantyre. 5 days was not enough to really do anything, though. If they had to go through this kind of lengthy, annoying journey in every single restart, only to be left with measly 5 days per restart to locate the Imperial staff, they were guaranteed to fail. Thus, their first and very urgent priority was to locate a Bakura gate somewhere on the continent. Any Bakura gate, really. That way they could reach the continent in only a handful of days with the help of silent doorway adepts in subsequent restarts. Sadly, this was not an easy task. Bakura gates were scattered all over Blantyre, but the continent was vast and the gates were small. Searching for them blindly would take forever, which meant they had no choice but to seek the natives for help in finding them. The trouble was, Blantyre was not inhabited by humans. The steaming equatorial jungle that covered Blantyre was home to a multitude of sapient species, but the most advanced and powerful force were the lizard men. They lived in great stone cities along the coast and the rivers, and although they were very awfully primitive by human standards, they were more or less the only ones qualified to help Zack and Zorian locate a Bakura gate somewhere around here. Not only were they the only species on Blantyre that kept any sort of written records, they also regularly traded with humans from Zlotic and Altazia, which meant that some of them actually spoke a language that Zack and Zorian could understand. Unfortunately, while the lizard men did occasionally trade with humans, getting the location of a nearby Bakura gate out of them was still a huge chore. For one thing, they existed as a collection of small kingdoms and quarreling city-states that rarely shared information with one another, so unless a Bakura gate was literally in their territory there was no chance they would know about such a strange but ultimately useless artifact. For another, only the priesthood was literate and knowledgeable of obscure places and artifacts like these, and they were not terribly fond of outsiders. Finally, while the lizard men did occasionally trade with humans, they did so with great caution and only in a strictly regulated manner. If they wanted information, they couldn't just walk into a lizard man city and start asking questions. They had to go through official channels and make a formal request. Pressed for time as they were, Zack and Zorian resorted to shock and awe to get what they want. Rather than carefully approaching the local rulers and making respectful diplomatic requests for information about Bakura gates, they brazenly flew Pearl of Aranhal straight above the nearest lizardman city, teleported themselves into the city center and then started throwing around gold, gems and some spices that they heard lizardmen liked at everyone in the vicinity until someone came to talk to them, at which point they promised great rewards for any information about the Bakura gates. Then they moved on and repeated this process in every larger city they encountered as they flew around the coast. The reaction was everything they hoped it would be. The lizard men may be primitive, but they had their ways, and news of their airship and what they were seeking quickly spread to every lizard man power in the vicinity. Soon, everyone knew that two immensely powerful human mages were flying around in their fancy airship and promising fantastic rewards to anyone who could lead them to a Bakura gate. Admittedly, this did cause a lot of the lizard men to come forward with fabricated tales of nearby Bakura gates, but those were easily seen through by Zorian. Lizard men emotions were not alien enough to give Zorian's empathy too much trouble. Eventually, 3 days later, they were summoned by one of the local kings from a river city-state deeper in the continent's interior. The emissary brought with him a very lifelike drawing of a Bakura gate as proof that they were telling the truth, which was good enough for Zack and Zorian to immediately set out towards the place. This was why, at the moment, the two of them were standing in a luxurious stone throne room of a lizardman king, curiously observing their surroundings while they waited for the king to actually arrive and talk to them. Lizardmen rulers seemed to be fond of mosaics made out of gems and colored stones, and this one was not an exception. The walls were dominated by some kind of epic battle scene between two lizardmen forces. One of the two sides, which Zorian presumed to represent the forces of the city they were currently in, was clearly dominating their opponents, boldly advancing forward, while the other was in the process of being pierced by spears, clubbed over the head by heavy clubs or down on their knees and begging for mercy. An absolutely giant lizardman floated in the sky above the scene, curiously observing the battle. Probably a representation of one of the lizardman gods. Zorian's idle musings were interrupted by the loud entrance of the lizardman king. A procession of musicians playing some kind of annoying flute-like instruments came first, playing ear-splitting whistles while a bunch of lizardmen children ran around and threw petals on the ground in front of the approaching king. The lizard-man throne guards, which had been leaning on their spears and chatting amongst themselves in their incomprehensible lizard-man tongue, quickly assumed a proper posture and pretended they had been alert and battle-ready all this time. They also banged their spears against the floor a few times and let loose a keening wail that was probably some kind of salute. As for Zack and Zorian, they just stared at the spectacle, not sure how to react. Perhaps because they had arrived so unexpectedly or because those rulers had not been so wealthy and powerful as this one, but this was not the way the other lizard-men kings had behaved in front of them. What's the proper procedure for greeting a lizard-man ruler again? Are we supposed to bow or shake hands or something? Zack whispered to him uncertainly. Why are you asking me? Zorian protested. Your nobility, not me. You should be the one who knows things like this. Please, Zack scoffed. You're the one who is constantly interacting with various talking monsters. This is totally your area of expertise. Zorian turned his attention to the approaching king. He was surprisingly short compared to the warriors scattered around his palace, though the massive gem-encrusted headdress and glittering golden jewelry hanging off of him immediately marked him as the ruler regardless. In one of his hands he carried a black staff with a large, glowing, amber stone affixed on top. Four particularly massive lizard-man warriors flanked him on both sides, which made for a somewhat amusing contrast between them and their king. What was not so amusing was the look in their eyes and the emotions they were radiating. Unlike the normal palace guards, these four took their jobs very seriously and their yellow, slitted eyes followed them with a threatening intensity. If they made so much as a threatening movement, they were ready to shove a spear through their throat without warning. Also accompanying the king was another lizard-man with lots of jewelry and an elaborate headdress, although one less impressive and of slightly different type and color scheme. Zorian suspected that he was pretty sure it was a female lizard-man, was the high priest of the city. And though she wasn't as overtly hostile as the king's honor guard, she clearly did not like them. At all. Zorian inwardly sighed. Of course nothing could ever be easy. Zack and Zorian had already managed to claim the imperial ring from the ziggurat of the sun in the past. Since they now knew that it was held by the Solrotham high priest, getting it was slightly easier than it had previously been, when they had yet to even locate where it was. However, easier didn't mean easy. The Solrotham high priest resided in the innermost, most heavily defended portion of the ziggurat. Getting to him still required a large-scale assault on the Solrotham settlement, which was non-ideal. Rather than organize another assault on the ziggurat of the sun in this restart, Zorian agreed to try something different this time around. After establishing a base near the ziggurat using Bakura gates, they brought over a dozen or so Iranian mercenaries and instructed them to spy on Solrotham guards and patrols. Although Solrotham mines were as alien to the Irania as they were to Zorian, the Irania were far more experienced with making sense of alien mines than he was. They did it all their lives, after all. At the same time they began ambushing and killing Solrotham hunting parties and patrol groups leaving the ziggurat, in the hopes that doing this continually would eventually force the high priest to confront them directly or at least motivate to Solrotham to try and negotiate with them. After all, the colony would surely starve if they couldn't send anyone outside without them disappearing, right? Unfortunately, the Solrotham didn't behave like they hoped they would. Rather than investigate the problem, they simply barricaded themselves inside and no longer tried to leave the ziggurat. It was baffling. Either the colony had sizable stockpiles of preserved food and felt certain they could last for a while under siege, or there was a dungeon entrance somewhere below the ziggurat and they decided to brave the tunnels to feed themselves instead. Either way, it was annoying. Thankfully, the Irania were somewhat successful in their information gathering. So, Zorian asked the Irania in front of him. I don't think the damn wasps are going to poke their heads out of their turtle shells anytime soon. Do you have something useful to report? I think so, yeah, Storm Dream, the Irania in question, answering him through a voice spell so Zack could hear her too. First of all, the ring you're after. It's not an accident that the High Priest has it on him. He knows what it does and is actively using it. Oh. Now that I think about it, that does make sense, Zorian mused. I could tell the last time we met that he's a soul mage. That was a bit unusual, since Solrotham aren't exactly known for their magic abilities, but I thought nothing of it at the time. Since he's wearing a ring that grants soul sight, though, I guess it's to be expected he became interested in that type of magic. We're fortunate he didn't populate the ziggurat with undead guards or something. Probably wouldn't happen, even if he knew how to do that, Storm Dream said. They're very religious and they seem to attach great importance to being cremated upon death. Some nonsense about returning to the Sun Mother, and whatnot. Well, they should be happy about all those patrols we fireballed to death recently, then, Zack said cheekily. They got a proper burial as they died. Yes. Well, Storm Dream said after a second of awkward silence. If you want to lure the High Priest out of the ziggurat, I have only two ideas. One is to wait for him to come outside on his own to perform one of his periodic land blessings and reading of the signs. The next such occasion should be about 2 months from now and... Too long, Zack immediately said, shaking his head. I don't understand why you're in such a hurry about this. The ring has been in the High Priest's hands for years now. It's not going anywhere, Storm Dream said, with no small amount of exasperation. But fine. The other option is to try and ally yourself with the nearby Solrotham tribe that this particular bunch has a rivalry with. I'm not entirely sure, but I think he would come out of the ziggurat and support his warriors if he thought it was a rival tribe attacking them instead of scary human mages with their unfair, mysterious magic and thundersticks. Ah, nodded Zorian. The thought of seeing if the tribe had any local enemies and allying with them had honestly didn't even occur to him. A silly mistake, in retrospect. Zack and Zorian discussed the merits of the idea for a while, before Zorian noticed that Storm Dream was shifting in place uncomfortably and looked like she wanted to say something more. What? He asked her. It's probably just a stupid coincidence, but the Solrotham High Priest has the same kind of knife you do, she said. My knife? Zorian asked incredulously. Since when did he even carry a knife? Oh. Oh. You mean this? He tapped the knife hanging from his backpack. It was the divine artifact they had recovered from the palace orb, the one they had no idea what it did. Zorian sometimes liked to inspect it, staring at it while futilely hoping he would finally succeed in unlocking its mysteries. Yes, like that one, Storm Dream said. I know you humans churn out thousands of identical objects as a matter of course, but I thought it was strange that a Solrotham High Priest on another continent carries the same kind of knife like you do. Especially since their one is of immense religious importance to them and has an impressive magical ability. Oh. Do tell, Zack prompted. What magical ability? The High Priest can use it to command a sandworm of immense size hidden beneath the sands of this place, Storm Dream said. It could be just more superstitious nonsense, I guess, but I don't think so. Maybe the Solrotham are overstating the worm's real size, but they seem pretty certain of its ability to repel all intruders, so it should be pretty impressive. If your knife is the same, then maybe you can control it too. Zack and Zorian were silent for a moment. I knew it was stupid, Storm Dream said. Just forget I said anything. Zorian thought about the gigantic flying sandworm they had faced in their last assault on this place. The creature was an immense threat, only kept manageable by Zack's incredible combat prowess and their extensive preparations before the battle. And the way its mind had completely stopped Zorian's mental abilities like a brick wall, unlike any other mental defense he had ever seen. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Zack asked him quietly. I doubt our dagger can really control the Solrotham sandworm, Zorian said. But it's too bad that we already killed the giant hydra guarding the palace orb, I'll say that much. It was just a suspicion, but Zorian felt it was likely that each knife was keyed into a different creature. Assuming that the strange flying sandworm was the divinely enhanced guardian of the Imperial Ring, it made sense that a knife that the Solrotham probably found near the ring was keyed to it. By the same logic, the knife Zorian currently held in his hand was probably meant to control the Hydra instead, since it normally seemed to live in and guard the orb. "Next time, then," said Zack dreamily. "I like the idea of having my own pet Hydra, you know. We could pit it against the stupid sandworm while we tackle the Solrotham ourselves. Or we could throw him at Quatakikl, just to see the look on that stupid bag of bones when a massive Hydra starts screaming and charging at him, or just take it on a walk through Scioria like some kind of oversized dog and just soak in the people's reactions. Lots of potential there." Zorian looked at the dagger in his hand and then grasped it tightly. Next time, indeed. As the end of the restart began to approach, Zack and Zorian turned their attention to something they had been gradually building up to throughout the entire restart: raiding the royal vaults for the dagger again. They sought out Quatakikl for help again, too partially because they still hadn't grasped the details on the inner wards, so his help in getting inside was still critical, and partially because they still had designs on his crown. Zorian had to admit he was more morally conflicted about betraying Quatakikl this time around. After all, the ancient Lich had been nothing but helpful throughout the entire restart. It felt wrong, dishonorable, to just stab him in the back like this in the end. Then again, didn't Quatakikl indicate during that initial negotiation they had with him that he would return to interrogate them after his little invasion business was over? Perhaps he was just looking for excuses to make himself better, but seen in that light this attack could easily be viewed as preemptive defense on their part. Plus, the Lich clearly intended to invade Scioria as normal, a fact he sometimes cryptically alluded to during his lessons, but one which he never actually made clear to them. In a very real way, that was betrayal as well. He supposed in the end it didn't matter. Quatakikl once again agreed to help them steal the dagger from the Eldamar's royal vaults. They once again achieved their goal, successfully fought their way out of the capital city, and then kept running from the Eldamar military until Quatakikl figured out the nature of the tracking device that was used to track them. They again opened a dimensional gate to Zlotic and stepped through it. The moment Quatakikl followed after them, they shut off the gate and attacked him with no warning. There was no talking. They attacked silently and without hesitation, and Quatakikl took their ambush entirely in stride. As an endless barrage of incinerating rays, impossibly sharp dimensional blades and disintegration blasts suddenly rained down on him, he quietly blocked, dodged, teleported and retaliated in return. He did not rage at their betrayal or try to talk to them to find out their reasons. Perhaps he had been expecting it. Maybe he was just that used to sudden ambushes. Whatever the case, he silently accepted their challenge and met their attack head-on. The desert quaked. Sand was melted and turned to glass over and over. Several hidden wards and traps that Zack and Zorian prepared in the area in advance activated, only to be shattered and neutralized by Quatakikl. The ancient Lich summoned a bunch of skeletal undead giants from some internal storage space on his person, and Zorian responded by throwing his combat golems at them to keep them busy. Zack managed to shear off Quatakikl's leg with one of his attacks, but the Lich simply reattached it in the next moment. 3 of Zorian's simulacrums sacrificed themselves to keep him alive when facing Quatakikl's counterattacks, their inhumanly tough metallic bodies unable to withstand the ancient Lich's attacks. It was then, right in the middle of the heated battle, that several hidden devices revealed themselves in the distance, blanketing the whole area with small, fast-moving silver discs. Most of the silver discs were completely mundane, meant purely to mask the real threats. Some of them were infused with specialized magic meant to stress and overload typical force shields that protected mages against physical projectiles. And finally, a small number were special. They were infused with the same sort of soul-severing magic that was once used by Kale to make the coin that ended up banishing Quatakikl back to his phylactery. In order to make sure Quatakikl couldn't simply push away all the discs with a simple wave of his hand, Zack and Zorian immediately intensified their attacks. Despite that, Quatakikl took the little silver projectiles as a deadly threat, never letting a single one touch him, raising the ground as walls and pillars to keep them at bay when the shield disruptors started to eat away at his magical shields. But the silver discs did their job of occupying his attention anyway. So busy was he with avoiding them, dealing with Zack and Zorian's normal attacks and trying to counterattacks that he overlooked a far larger silver disc hidden in the sands nearby. This disc was also imbued with soul-severing magic, and with a much more potent form of it, too. Upon dodging one of their attacks, Quadakikl ended up stepping on it and it visibly discharged a wave of white light straight into him. For a moment, the whole battlefield stilled. Quadakikl was momentarily frozen in place, a look of surprise on his face. Zack and Zorian waiting with bated breaths to see if the Lich would collapse into a lifeless pile of bones in the aftermath. And then the Lich moved. "Heh," Quadak said, speaking up for the first time since the battle had started. "You got me. But do you really think a stupid trick like that can beat me?" Well, no. He did not think that. But as a distraction, it worked better than Zorian had ever hoped it would. The moment Quadakikl had finished talking, a massive wave of dispelling energy erupted out of Zack, powered by most of Zack's remaining mana. It washed away everything in the vicinity, completely catching Quadakikl off guard. For just a moment, all of his defenses went down, including his mind blank. Zorian immediately reached out with his mind and began his attack. Quadakikl's mental defenses were impeccably made. They were thick and without any obvious flaws, and he could rebuild them in an instant, just like Svim. Considering his endless reserves of mana, this meant that even Zorian would fail to break through them if he tried to gradually wear them down. He could never hope to win a battle of attrition against the ancient Lich, not to mention that every second he failed to break through was a second that Quadakikl could use to murder his fleshy body to remove the mental threat he posed. Thus, Zorian held nothing back when attacking the Lich. He poured all of his mana into a quick succession of telepathic attacks. After 3 such attacks, he was delighted to see some actual exploitable flaws starting to appear. Quadakikl was proficient enough in fixing the aftermath of a single mental attack, but multiple ones in succession strained his defenses. As powerful as he was, the ancient Lich had probably not encountered a mind mage that could meaningfully threaten him for a very, very long time. His defenses had probably once been truly flawless, but since he had not had to use them in ages, he had gotten a bit rusty. Too rusty to stop Zorian, in any case. With one final push, Quadakikl's mental barrier shattered into countless pieces, leaving his mind defenseless before Zorian's telepathic might. Letting loose an ear-splitting scream of incoherent rage, Quadakikl swung his skeletal hand toward Zorian, firing a jagged red ray in his general direction. Zorian did not stop. Even when the ray hit him, severing his left arm just below the shoulder and sending waves of incredible pain throughout his whole body, he did not stop. He sank deeper and deeper into Quadakikl's mind, paralyzing his skeletal body and starting to root through his long-term memories. Without warning, the mind Zorian was invading suddenly disappeared. The bones Quadakikl had been animating fell to the ground, lifeless. The Lich had admitted defeat and fled. "Ha! We did it," yelled Zack breathlessly. "Oh man, I can't believe we actually succeeded in beating the stupid bag of bones. Oh shit. Zorian, your arm." "Why yeah, I know," Zorian said, looking at the mangled stump connected to his left shoulder. "I'm not feeling too well. I think I'm going to lie down a little." Zack was saying something, but Zorian could no longer hear him. Everything was kind of fuzzy and eventually he just closed his eyes and let himself fall to the ground. 2 hours later, Zorian had woken up from unconsciousness only to find Zack beside him and his wound professionally bandaged. "It was just something he had learned while learning medical magic," Zack explained. Apparently his teachers had insisted he learn some good old-fashioned mundane care for the injuries, and lost limbs were included in these lessons. So now Zorian would get to experience what it was like to live with a missing arm for a few days. Lovely. The time loop was a gift that just kept on giving. In any case, they had to move fast. Quadakikl was bound to be utterly furious with them, and they weren't really sure how long it would take him to possess another body and come after them. They had learned that this time varied a lot from lich to lich while researching the topic, ranging from a few hours to several days. Considering how good Quadakikl was, they should probably assume it was the shorter option. After hurriedly breaking into the time magic research facility beneath Cyoria, they asked Guardian of the Threshold about the crown and dagger they had newly acquired. They quickly found out that they had guessed correctly. The crown gave the controller the ability to place temporary markers on people, bringing them into the time loop for a limited time, while the dagger gave the controller an ability to place a special kind of marker on a soul of the target, letting the time loop know it should not recreate their soul in future restarts. Soul kill, as Red Robe called it. Just like the orb and the ring, both items also had a mundane function that even normal people could use. The crown acted as a personal mana storage, which they already knew thanks to Quadakikl, but it was nice to have confirmation anyway. In particular, Quadakikl's story had not made it clear whether the amount of personal mana stored in the crown was proportional to the one using it or fixed. Now they knew it was fixed in size. For Quadakikl this gave him 10 times more mana reserves than he usually had, but for Zorian it would be far more since his reserves were relatively tiny in comparison. Though it would also take him forever to fully fill up the crown, as well. As for the dagger, it had the ability to cut that which cannot be cut, or to put it more plainly, it could hurt immaterial spirits. An ability that was probably far more impressive in the distant past, when spirits were around every corner and a pissed-off god could send their servants to mess you up at any time. These days, its base ability was of dubious usefulness. Upon leaving the time magic research facility, they temporarily set the dagger aside and started feverishly tinkering with the crown, trying to figure how to activate its ability to place temporary markers while sending urgent messages to every member of their little conspiracy. Thankfully, by now they had a fair bit of experience in making Imperial artifacts work, so after a few hours they succeeded in figuring out how the crown worked. And then they got to work. By now, a whole throng of people had gathered around them. It was not just people like Alanik, Svim, Silverlake and Daimen that were there. There were also various teachers from the academy, some of whom Zorian was familiar with, Ilsa, Nora and Kiran, and some of whom he wasn't, but which Svim assured him were dependable and could be counted on. Kerma, Torin and several other select members of Damon's team were also there, as was his fiancée Orissa and some of the members of her house. Many Arania were also scattered about, hailing from the Silent Doorway adepts, luminous advocates, filigree sages and others that Zorian felt could be helpful and wouldn't freak out. Lukav was also here, as were some other people that Alanik had vouched for. While Zack and Zorian had been running around Blantyr, planning how to beat Quadakikl and scouting out the Solrotham in the Ziggurat of the Sun, their fellow conspirators had been tasked with gathering all these people and informing them about the time loop. Thus, everyone here knew what they were dealing with. They did not necessarily believe in this crazy story, but that didn't really matter because seeing was believing. The restart was soon going to end, and then they would experience the truth firsthand. Zorian steeled himself a little and went out to face the crowd around them. Zorian, what the hell happened to your arm? Taven asked him with a horrified expression. It doesn't matter, he said, waving her off with his one remaining hand. I'll get it back soon, as good as new. So, said Zack happily. Who wants to be first? Good morning, brother. Kiriel screamed, her voice disgustedly shrill and cheerful. Morning, morning, morning. Zorian sighed, stretching his arms and legs while Kiriel babbled on top of him. Another restart, another annoying wake-up call from Kiriel. He gave his little sister a silent, complex look, which caused her to hesitate for a second and ask him what's wrong. Zorian didn't answer. Instead he suddenly started shaking like a madman, taking advantage of that brief moment of indecision when she loosened her grip on him to push her off to the side. She fell on the floor with a soft thud and an indignant yell. She was back on her feet in a flash, though, annoying him with questions about the academy and requests to show her some magic. In other words, she was still the same old Kiriel he had come to know over the restarts. He had thought about including her among the many people who gotten a temporary marker in the previous restart, but in the end he had decided bringing her into the time loop would be reckless and cruel. Unlike the others, Kyrielle was just a child. Her personality had yet to fully form, and there was no telling how being stuck in a constantly repeating month would warp her thinking. She also couldn't keep a secret to save her life and had no way to really contribute to their projects. Not to mention that if he failed to find the way to extend the temporary markers before the 6th restart was up, he would have to watch her forget 6 months' worth of memories. That would be a hard pill to swallow. No, the idea was definitely off limits. While he would have appreciated a chance to have more meaningful interaction with Kyrielle, it wasn't worth inflicting existential dread on a 9-year-old and dragging down everyone's chances of survival just for that. After a few minutes, he finally coaxed Kyrielle into leaving the room. He promptly locked the door and created a single simulacrum. It was a simple ectoplasmic copy. This early in the restart, he had neither the time nor the materials to create the golem bodies necessary for the improved mechanical simulacrums he usually liked to use. However, accessibility was more important than mana efficiency in this case. He needed the simulacrum now and not later. The moment it popped into existence, the simulacrum gave him a silent nod and then teleported away. There was no need to explain anything. The simulacrum had a simple task, planned out all the way in the previous restart and now simply put into practice. His copy was to go to Scioria and immediately hunt down and dismantle all 4 cephalic rat swarms lurking in the city. It would doubtlessly alarm Quatakikl if he did that, but it had to be done. With all these new time loopers walking around, the swarms were too much of a threat. They needed them gone, and the sooner it was done, the better. After dispatching the simulacrum to his task, Zorian went down into the kitchen to eat something while waiting for Ilsa to arrive. He couldn't help but be a little nervous. While Ilsa's visit at the beginning of the restart had long since become repetitive and routine, meeting his invocations teacher should be different this time around. She was, after all, one of the people they placed a temporary marker on. If everything went well, she had retained her memories of the previous restart. He shook his head, trying to collect his thoughts. He was kind of annoyed at himself for being so emotional over this. Previously, when he and Zack were considering going down this road, he had imagined himself facing this scenario with a stoic attitude and cool assurance born out of years of experiences and conflicts in the time loop, but reality was cruel and his nerves were not as steely as he imagined them to be. Would the temporary markers work as advertised? Would they work at all? Would Ilsa be able to take first-hand experience of the time loop in good grace, or would she flip out and start flinging spells at him, demanding answers? He couldn't help but worry about questions such as this as minutes ticked by. What was taking her so long, anyway? He wasn't sure, but he thought it didn't usually take this much time before she. There was a knock at the door. "I'll get it," said Zorian quickly, rushing for the door. Mother looked amused at this kind of reaction, but said nothing as he ran past her. He opened the door and found Ilsa standing there. She looked no different than she usually did at the beginning of the restart. The same clothes, the same judging look, the same stack of documents held in her hands. However, that was only outward appearance. To his empathic senses, she was practically radiating uncertainty and apprehension. They stared at each other in silence for a while. "May I come in?" Ilsa eventually asked. "Oh," said Zorian with a small laugh, wincing inwardly at his behavior. "I guess I spaced out a little. Forgive my manners, Miss Salady. Come in, please." "Thank you, Mr. Kaczynski," she said, stepping into the house. Although his momentary brain freeze wasn't the most flattering way to start a meeting like this, it seemed to have put Ilsa at ease somewhat, as he felt a lot of the tension drain out of her in the aftermath. Like usual, Mother immediately left the house when she realized who had come, taking Kyrielle with her. This left Zorian alone with Ilsa to ostensibly discuss his electives and whatnot. But, well, same as the last time, I suppose. Ilsa asked, waving the academy documents in front of her. When Zorian answered yes, she simply threw the stack to the side and sighed. Of course. You probably heard this all 100 times by now. I don't even know why I brought these along with me. Clinging to a sense of normalcy in light of a very bizarre situation, Zorian guessed. I was the same, back when I was first dragged into the time loop. I spent quite a few loops going through the motions. You were a teenager who barely started learning magic, though. I am an experienced adult mage. I should be better than this, Ilsa countered, frowning slightly. She was silent for a few seconds, tapping her fingers against the table as she considered what to say next. So this is real. We really travel back in time. It's a little more complex than that, but yes, Zorian said. He didn't want to get bogged down in details of how the time loop actually worked. Did the marker we gave you work? Obviously, she scoffed. How would we be having this conversation otherwise? What I meant was, did you completely retain your magic and memories? Zorian clarified. Any holes in your recollection or difficulty in doing magic? That's a possibility, she asked, surprised. It might be. As I said in the previous restart, this is the first time we have done something like this, Zorian said. She gave it a thought for a minute before shaking her head. I don't feel there are any obvious blanks in my memories, she said. I did forget quite a few things, but I think that's just me being forgetful as usual. My memory is hardly flawless. As for magic, well, I'm a grown mage that has reached most of her potential years ago, and a month is not that long of a time. Plus, it wasn't like I did any real training sessions in the span of this month. In other words, any growth in shaping skills you may have experienced is so minuscule that you wouldn't even notice if it was gone, Zorian surmised. Yes, that, Ilsa nodded. I guess I can learn a new spell or two this time just to see if I retain them the next time the world resets. I can probably just ask Kale. The effect of even 1 month on his shaping skills and spell knowledge should be dramatic enough to tell, pointed out Zorian. I suppose that's true, said Ilsa. Plus, now that I think about it, I'm probably going to improve my shaping skills and learn quite a few new spells just by helping you out over time. Though you never did really explain what you wanted our help with. Yes, we did not explain our plans and reasons too deeply in the previous restart, admitted Zorian. Partly because we didn't want to overwhelm people with information, but also because we suspected you would only take us seriously after you witnessed the time loop with your own 2 eyes. Ha! Well, you're probably right about that, Ilsa laughed. Sven tried to explain how the time loop worked when he was trying to convince me to accept a mysterious soul marker from my 2 teenage students. I confess I didn't pay too much attention to it, since the whole idea was so crazy. I'd have probably been even less interested in what you and Zach had to say. Well, at least she was honest. Do you want me to explain now? Zorian asked. No, she said immediately. I don't think I could pay attention well enough at the moment. I'm still rather disturbed at reliving the same month all over again. You said this has been happening for a while now? Yes. The time loop has repeated itself many, many times, Zorian said. This is just your first time remembering it. So, before this I was just, obliviously reliving the same month over and over again. Repeated the jobs, taught the same classes and spoke the same conversations. Well, sometimes me and Zach shook things up a bit and you reacted accordingly, reacting to the changes, Zorian said. But yes. Without a marker, people do not retain continuity across restarts. I tried to talk to some of the people around me before coming here, Ilsa admitted. Just to check if they really don't remember anything. I couldn't resist. I don't think I revealed anything crucial, but I feel it's only fair to let you know. Zorian sighed. He suspected she wasn't the only one to make such discreet tests, and that there would be more of that stuff to deal with later, but that was okay. They kind of expected that. I understand the need for confirmation, but please try to be responsible about this, he said. It would be a disaster if the knowledge of the time loop reached certain people. And now I'm being lectured by one of my teenage students, Ilsa said, clacking her tongue. How low the mighty have fallen. But fair enough, I do understand we have a mighty, millennia-old lich breathing down our necks. Your fight against him has left quite an impression on me, I must say. Zorian just made a slightly sour expression in response. Unsurprisingly, Quadakikl had taken great offense at them trying to look through his memories and stealing his crown. While Zack and Zorian were placing temporary markers on people, Quadakikl was burning down the Novita estate in Amaya's house as the first step of his revenge. Fortunately, all inhabitants of Amaya's place had been evacuated to Koth by that point, and Zack couldn't care less about the Novita estate. The ancient Lich remained quiet after that, probably because he couldn't find them and still had an invasion to execute. Then Zack and Zorian had the bright idea to bring the new loopers to Scioria on Invasion Day, to show them how high the stakes really were. Despite being under a plethora of powerful divination wards and constantly moving, Quadakikl somehow noticed them. The resulting fight completely leveled the street they were fighting in. Though Quadakikl is a huge danger, I'm pretty sure the Eldamarian government, the Triumvirate Church, powerful noble houses and other powers would also make problems for us if they knew, Zorian said. So please be careful. They spent the next half an hour discussing various things, the mechanics of the time loop, the way things usually developed if Zack and Zorian did not interfere with things, and the details behind the Abasan invasion. Ilsa turned out to be just as interested in the invasion of Scioria as she was in the time loop itself. Then again, that was probably not too unusual. They brought people to witness the attack for a reason. You don't seem to care much for the suffering and devastation we witnessed, Ilsa eventually said, a note of condemnation in her voice. I'm just a little numb to it all, that's all. I've seen it happen too many times, sometimes from the memories of the invaders themselves, Zorian said. It's impossible for me to have the same visceral reaction to it that you probably have. You read their memories? She asked, surprised. I had to, he simply said. Of course you've dabbled in mind magic too, she said in a strange tone. Dabbled? Zorian huffed. This annoys me more than it probably should. I did not dabble in it. I'm a natural mind mage who spent years honing his skills. She seemed to be at a loss for words upon hearing that. This situation is endlessly bizarre and disturbing, she finally said after a few seconds. Agreed, Zorian nodded. I've been stuck in this time loop for nearly 8 years, not counting all the time dilation chambers, and I still think that. Time dilation chambers? Ilsa asked. She suddenly shook her head. No, never mind that for now. 8 years is actually not as long as I thought it would be. I got included rather late into this thing, Zorian said. Zack is the one who has spent decades inside the time loop. Ugh. Every answer gives me 5 new questions, Ilsa complained. You know what? Let's stop this for now. You are planning to take the train to Scioria, right? Yes, I'm taking Kiriel with me, so I need to pretend I'm somewhat normal. Of course, if you are willing to teleport us to Scioria yourself. No, she said immediately. I'm taking a train ride with you instead. Zorian was taken aback at the proclamation. He knew that things would be very much different now that other loopers were walking around, but he couldn't help but get blindsided by things like this. Why? Zorian asked uncertainly. You might be used to it, but I've just watched the city get brutally invaded by hordes of monsters and undead, she told him. I'd like to stay away from Scioria for a while, and this is a convenient excuse. Oh, he said lamely. Come to think of it, it had only been a few hours at most since the invasion, at least from her perspective. You don't mind, do you? She asked him. Not at all, he said, shaking his head. Just watch out for Kiriel if you plan to ride in the same compartment as us. She has an intense interest in magic and anything related to it, and she's probably going to find you absolutely fascinating. I don't see a problem with that, Ilse smiled. It's nice to see kids interested in my work. Zorian didn't bother to clarify things. Some things were better as a surprise. Mother did not look very surprised when Ilse informed her she would be accompanying them to the train station. It probably seemed entirely sensible to her that Ilse would use a train to get back to Scioria. The two of them got along pretty well with one another, and were soon happily chatting along as they waited on the station for the train to arrive. Zorian mostly ignored the conversation, as it sounded like your typical parent-teacher discussion. Kiriel was too excited about going to Scioria to care about the teacher that had decided to stick around for a while longer, but Fortov did feel the need to approach the group and say hi after seeing Ilse present. That was a little new. You didn't include Fortov among those who received the marker, Ilse observed quietly. No, Zorian whispered back. He's useless and I don't like him. Ilse had nothing to say in response to that, just giving him a guarded look in return. Maybe he really was a little harsh towards Fortov. Still, he honestly couldn't see any good reason to give the guy a temporary marker. Fortov was unreliable and had no work ethic, so including him in the time loop would be about as wise as including Kiriel. Eventually they boarded the train and set off towards Scioria. Kiriel became more wary of Ilse when she realized the teacher was going to stay in the same compartment as them, but well, it was Kiriel. Patience was never her strong suit. She barely lasted half an hour before she started bombarding Ilse with questions. Ilse was a patient woman, but after an hour and a half of Kiriel's chattiness, Zorian could feel she was starting to get rather exasperated with the whole situation. Thus, he decided to have mercy on her and distracted his little sister with a bunch of visually impressive illusions and stories. Ilse observed the illusionary scenes he conjured up with a surprising amount of interest. Try as he might, he just couldn't figure out what she found so fascinating about those. Weren't they just illusions? She was a mage at the continent's best magical academy. Surely she had seen plenty of those in her life. Eventually he decided to ask her. Since he didn't want Kiriel to listen in on them, he established a mental link to her and spoke to her telepathically. She was badly startled at first, flinching at the sudden voice in her head, but she recovered quickly. Her response was swift and smooth, with no unintentional thoughts leaking through. It was clear that she had experience with this kind of communication. You can ignore the shaping disruption of the train wards, Ilse telepathically sent back through the link. I mean, of course you can. For someone like you, doing that is a minor thing. I could do it too. However, casting such sophisticated illusions while being suppressed by the wards that takes considerable skill. Did you say you were trying to pretend you are, somewhat normal? How is this even remotely normal? Well it's not like Kiriel can really tell how amazing this is, he sent back lamely. Truthfully, neither could he until this point. He learned these illusions pretty much solely to entertain Kiriel. They were just little tricks to him, and so was the ability to bypass the laughable disruption wards on the train. It completely slipped his mind that someone like Ilse could figure out exactly what he was doing and how difficult it was and find it notable. So, Ilse sent. You are good enough at combat magic to fight a 1,000-year-old lich. You are a mind mage and an illusionist. You can teleport around with ease and open dimensional gates. You can create duplicates of yourself. You are an expert golem maker, with all that implies. You say you achieved all of that in, what, 8 years? Pretty much, yeah, Zorian confirmed. Forgive me for being blunt here, Mr. Kaczynski, but aren't you a fairly average mage? Ilse asked curiously. I never got an impression that you are some amazingly talented person from the information I was given. And trust me, people had looked into it. Whenever a world-class talent like Daiman appears, their family is always investigated in case their boons run in the blood. Aside from being an innate mind mage, I am indeed pretty average, Zorian said calmly. Ilse's comment might have infuriated him once, but these days he no longer cared. I know what you're thinking, and yes, my rapid growth as a mage is all due to the time loop. It doesn't just give time, you know. It's also given me nigh limitless resources, access to restricted materials and plenty of normally unobtainable experience. It's also put me under enormous pressure, keeping me constantly motivated in a way I otherwise wouldn't be. I honestly think anyone could do what I did, if put in the same position. Well, provided they didn't just break under the pressure. Ilsa stayed quiet for a while, but Zorian could practically feel the gears turning in her head. She was probably realizing for the first time the sort of amazing opportunity the time loop represented. I think I'm getting just a tiny bit jealous of you, Mr. Kaczynski, Ilsa eventually concluded. Don't envy me just yet, he told her. There is still a good chance that I will get erased in the end, and everything I have worked for will be for naught. What? She asked, startled. What do you mean? With that, he started explaining the situation in detail to her. He told her about Red Robe, the uncertainty about whether they could even get out of the time loop, the problems he had to solve to survive the exit, and so on. It took a while to go through everything. Strangely enough, Ilsa looked calmer and more reassured by the end, even though he had just told her there was a big chance they would all lose everything at the end. Then again, maybe it wasn't so strange. She already knew that temporary markers like her own only lasted 6 months. Compared to that, a more distant deadline that would also destroy Zack and Zorian probably didn't seem so intimidating. On the contrary, she may have found it reassuring that they also had the same fate waiting for them, if they failed. I was wondering why you decided to include so many people in this time loop, instead of just monopolizing the whole thing for yourself and Zack. Your situation is quite desperate, she said, humming to herself audibly enough for Curiel to hear her and give her funny looks. You don't have to sound so happy about it, Zorian groused. But yes, we really do need your help badly. Ilsa was mostly included because of her connections. Though she acted a bit low-key most of the time, she knew many people and was owed quite a few favors. Hopefully, she could help them convince people to go along with whatever crazy plans they came up with and smooth any ruffled feathers they caused along the way. Considering how few other members of their little conspiracy were diplomatically inclined or familiar with bureaucratic wrangling, this was a valuable skill. Plus, she was a powerful alteration expert. Zorian wasn't sure, but he felt she might be able to help him produce his golems faster. She couldn't animate them, of course, but he was currently producing such a large number of them every restart that it took a while to simply create enough mechanical bodies for animation. If Ilsa was as good at alteration and material alchemy as Svim claimed, she should be able to take over that part of the production process and free Zorian to do other things. Why not just hire someone to do that for you? Ilsa asked when he told her that. I hear from Svim you've been doing that a lot already. I can't, Zorian shook his head. Anyone I contract will surely figure out what I intend to do with such a sophisticated metal doll, and making combat-capable golems is forbidden without a license. Makes sense, Ilsa said. You don't want to have random mages building themselves a private army of golems in their free time. Exactly, Zorian said. I might be able to coax a person to build me a single puppet, but if I order a batch of 20 puppets, they'll freak out. Nobody wants to get implicated in an attempted rebellion or whatever. I'd be lucky if they didn't immediately report me to the government when they throw me out of the shop. Ilsa nodded. After some thought, she changed the subject. You know, all this talk about golems and alteration is reminding me of something I thought of when you were explaining how the time loop works. Destroying the entire world and then recreating it out of nothing. It reminds me of a persistent ambition of mine. Oh. You mean true creation? Zorian guessed. You know about it? Ilsa was surprised. I don't remember talking about it around you. I suppose one of my previous incarnations told you about it. Yeah, Zorian confirmed. I sought you out quite often in the beginning to learn from you. You taught me much of what I know right now, or at least gave me a push in the right direction. We'll have to talk about that more on some other occasion, Ilsa said with a smile. It looks like you owe me and I don't even know about it. How am I supposed to know to seek you out for favors if I don't even know that I have leverage over you? But anyway, true creation, yes, in a way, the time loop is the ultimate expression of that desire of mine. A magic that creates an entire world, over and over again. Are you sure you have no idea how it is done? No, sorry, Zorian said apologetically. That power is absolutely godlike in scope and mystery. Or rather, primordial, since the Sovereign Gate seems to be made out of one of those. Considering the stories of mortal mages doing it in the past, and in light of the fact that there is a device that can repeatedly create an entire world, I am convinced it is easier than most people suspect. Maybe I'll be able to figure something out by observing this constantly recreated world I'm in, Ilsa said wistfully. Maybe, Zorian said doubtfully. He doubted she would really get anywhere with that, but he wouldn't stop her. Eventually, Kiriel dozed off and the telepathic conversation died down a little, leaving both Zorian and Ilsa lost in their own thoughts. The train continued its routine journey to Scioria. When Zorian, Kiriel and Ilsa arrived in Scioria and disembarked, they found there were people already waiting for them. Zack being there was kind of expected, but he was also accompanied by Svim, Kiran and Taven. Most people did not react to this, of course, but Kiriel knew damn well that there was something fishy about that and kept giving everyone weird glances and got really quiet for a time. Zorian also noticed Fortov staring at him weirdly in the distance. He wasn't sure how much his brother really knew about him, but he was probably aware that Zorian hadn't had any real friends until recently, so having a bunch of people wait for him at the train station was beyond unusual. He did not make any move or approach, though, since nobody was attacking anyone and Zorian didn't look like he needed help. After dropping off Kiriel at Imaya's place, the group found a secluded location and started talking. Kiran, their combat magic instructor, was included into the group due to his high combat skills and the fact he had connections to people in Eldamar's military. He was the first to speak up. These temporary markers you placed on us to retain our memories, can they be revoked? Kiran asked. Of course, the first thing they wanted to discuss was the markers. Zorian didn't blame them. He knew he would have been the same if he were in their place. He was kind of mystified why they hadn't just asked Zack about that while they were waiting instead of saving it until now, but maybe they had talked about other things, such as how the time loop worked. Or maybe they had just gathered together quite recently and hadn't had the time to discuss anything. He knew that Zack hated waiting and had a habit of showing up late, so he probably hadn't been at the train station for long. Yes, Zorian told him bluntly. At will? Kiran asked next. Well, we need the crown that is currently in Quadakikle's possession to do it, Zorian said carefully. So not really, no. Also, removing the marker only prevents you from keeping your magic and memories when the world resets next, Zack said. It doesn't wipe away what you achieved until that point. Can the marker be reapplied once it runs out or is revoked? Svim asked. I know what you're thinking, Zack sighed. Sadly, it's not that easy. Yes, you can place a marker on the same person the second time, but only after 12 restarts have passed. You can't just remove the marker and then reapply it to extend the time. I imagined it was something like that, Svim admitted. Zorian suddenly yelped in pain. After looking around, he realized Taven had pinched his arm for no discernible reason. Why did you do that? He protested. I wanted to make sure your arm is really fine, she said, frowning. Zorian suddenly realized this was the same arm that ended up getting cut off by Quadakikle in the previous restart. He had pretty much been a cripple the last time that she had seen him. Still, how the hell was it okay for her to just pinch him like that? Huffing with indignation, Zorian stepped away from Taven and maneuvered himself to place Ilsa between the two of them. Ilsa gave him an amused look in response. So what's the plan? Kiran said. We are hoping we can figure out a way to adjust the temporary markers into lasting indefinitely, Zorian said. Admittedly, tampering with a piece of magic that probably had gods involved in its construction sounds hopeless, but we suspect that Red Robe entered the time loop through this very method. If so, it should be possible for us to do it as well. Right, if Red Robe could have done it, surely all of us working together should be able to work something up, Zack said. And if you fail? Svim insisted. We will hopefully gather the entire key before all 6 restarts run out, at which point we will be able to unblock the exit, Zorian said. If we have an exit method also ready by then, we might be able to just get you out of the time loop at that point. At which point it doesn't really matter that your marker will run out. And what, you're just going to continue in the time loop alone afterwards? Taven asked. Or are you just going to create new temporary loopers once we're gone? And then get them out too? I don't know about the rest, but I think the world doesn't need 3 different Tavens. Actually, we would just exit the time loop with you, Zack said. We already got almost everything we could wish for out of the time loop. No need to risk everything by being greedy and cutting things close. If we can leave 6 months from now, we will. Silence greeted this proclamation. Zorian knew that the new loopers were worried about their motives, afraid that he and Zack were trying to make use of them as much as possible before discarding them. Not an unreasonable fear. Temporary markers were pretty much designed with that in mind. Presumably the controller would place these on people without ever informing them of the time limit, allowing them to reap all the benefits of having a person work with them for 6 months and then conveniently forgetting everything. However, Zack and Zorian did not intend to use the temporary markers just to get a convenient workforce. They got them into the mess and they would do their best to get them out of it. Maybe they would fail in the end, but it wouldn't be for the lack of trying. Well, Svim eventually said, breaking the silence. We'd best get to work, then. Days passed, and the effects of the many new loopers rapidly became evident. Kale arrived in Scioria earlier, barely a day after Zorian did. Lukav and Alanik did not need to be saved from Sudamir's machinations. Taven no longer bothered hunting monsters with her team. Ilsa's classes were completely different, since she decided she would shake things up a bit. The cephalic rats had been completely wiped out by Zorian's simulacrum on the very first day of the restart, with the exception of a handful of individuals the simulacrum had saved up for study. Their usual routine of convincing Svim, Alanik and Silverlake that the time loop was real became unnecessary, freeing up a surprisingly substantial amount of time. Finally, not having to gain the trust of the Silent Doorway adepts before they could use their ability to operate the Bakura Gate network meant they could access distant places from the very start of the restart. Thus, once Zack and Zorian had sorted out the situation in Scioria for a bit, they used a Bakura Gate to reach Koth so they could pick up the Imperial Orb and maybe get themselves a pet Hydra. Before they did that, though, they decided to visit the Terramachula estate to see if everything was fine there. Daimen had assured them that the people he had picked were reliable, but Zorian knew better than anyone that Daimen said a lot of things. When they arrived, they found the whole estate to be a hive of activity, people constantly coming and going, and there were people already waiting for them. There was no need to justify themselves or try to get them to admit Daimen was present, like they usually did the first time they contacted them in the restart. Still, while not having to wait at the door was convenient, what came later was not. Just like the new loopers back in Scioria, the new loopers in Koth also wanted their questions answered, and what was supposed to be just a short checkup ended up being a grueling question and answer session that lasted for most of the day. I really hope this is a one-time thing, Zorian groused later to Daimen. You were supposed to explain these sort of things to them, Daimen. I did. Daimen protested. They just wanted to hear things from you, I guess. Can you blame them? I guess not, Zorian said. If Daimen had explained things fairly, then these people must surely know it wasn't Daimen who was really in charge. It made sense that they wanted to talk to the people who are the source of the temporary markers and have first-hand information. Anyway, did you get your team ready? Will the Terramacula really cooperate when you inform them you want to send their best trackers all the way to Blantyre all of a sudden? This was the main reason he and Zack wanted Damon's cooperation, and why they allowed him to include so many people into the marked group. To put it bluntly, they needed these people to find the staff. They had managed to track down a Bakura gate on Blantyre in the previous restart, thanks to the help from that Lizardman King, but that was just the first step. The next was to track down a tiny little staff on a giant, jungle-covered continent. To put it bluntly, this was something that he and Zack alone were utterly incapable of doing. Zorian would never say this out loud to Daimen, but he and his group were probably the most critical people to receive the temporary markers. Without them, they would probably never find the staff. This was one of the primary reasons they decided to go down this path to begin with. My team will listen to me, even if I tell them we're going to Blantyre through a dimensional gate opened up by my little brother, Daimen said proudly. Hell, they'd probably go along with it even if I alone received the marker, but they would complain more. With Torin, Kerma, and other critical members of the team also on board, though, everyone will readily fall in line. As for the Terramacula, well, I'm not sure what level of support we can get out of them, but we will definitely get something. The main problem is that we're being a bit unreasonable and pushing for full commitment to this project without the idea being even hinted at before now. That's not how House Terramacula usually does things, to say the least, so some tension and incredulity are to be expected. Will it help if I give you money and resources to throw at them? Zorian asked. I know House Terramacula is not poor, but I'm pretty sure me and Zack could gather enough money to finance a small state if we really try. Not to mention a large amount of priceless materials that cannot be bought on the open market. Daimen looked at him with a strange mixture of horror and joy, his face alternating between various unusual grimaces. I hate you, he finally said. You better plan to gift some of that money to your poor older brother when we get out. Aren't you pretty well off? Zorian asked, arching his eyebrow at him. You're even marrying into nobility. You can never have enough money, Daimen said. Never. And yes, please do send all that money here if you can. Trying to flat out bribe the Terramacula directly with it wouldn't go well, but I'm sure they would look more favorably on the plan if we agreed to pay for all the equipment and mercenaries out of our own pockets. And some completely unrelated gifts would probably be appreciated. Zorian nodded and made a mental note to mention the matter to Zack. And speaking of Zack, his fellow time traveler, well, one of his fellow time travelers, now was already waiting for them at the front gate, humming to himself happily. Zorian didn't have to ask to know what the other boy was thinking of at the moment. Say, Zorian asked Daimen. Do you know what the legality of owning a giant, magically enhanced Hydra is in Eldamar? Just asking for a friend. Deep in the jungles of Koth, in what was otherwise an unremarkable patch of rainforest, a situation was unfolding. The trees shook, the animals vacated the area in panic, and the underbrush was trampled underfoot as a gigantic, furious Hydra thundered through the area in pursuit of its target. Its 8 heads fanned out and snapped angrily towards anything in the vicinity that failed to get out of its way, breaking low-hanging branches and killing any animal that was too slow to flee. As for Zorian, who was its target, he simply kept running and dodging while marveling at the incredible speed with which the Hydra was able to move through the thick vegetation of the rainforest. He had thought its size would make maneuvering difficult and allow him to easily keep ahead of it, but he had seriously underestimated its ability to just plow through everything in front of it without stopping. He was purposely running through the most difficult terrain he could find, and he never even came close to losing it. It was constantly trailing just behind him. A blue, translucent, ectoplasmic eye constantly trailed after Zorian, hovering above his head and staring at the Hydra. It was through this eye that Zorian was able to keep track of the Hydra's movements and dodge its attacks, despite having his back turned to it. Otherwise, if he were forced to run blind or had to periodically slow down to turn around, the Hydra would have grabbed him 100 times by now. Though the spell itself was very simple, very few people would be able to process information from 2 different perspectives like that. The fact Zorian could look both in front of him and behind him at the same time, while maneuvering through a treacherous, obstacle-filled jungle floor was proof that his experiments with mental enhancement were bearing some fruit. The chase led them next to a fallen, rotting log covered in moss and mushrooms. Without its main body slowing down at all, one of the Hydra's 8 heads reached down and bit into it, lifting it out of the ground and launching it at Zorian. Half a dozen monstrous centipedes and one very terrified squirrel tumbled out of the rotting log as it sailed through the air, having hidden in it when they noticed the rampaging Hydra approaching. Zorian reacted instantly, making a few silent movements and causing a bright red ectoplasmic hand to materialize in the air behind him and slap the log aside. It collided with the nearby tree where it exploded into a shower of rotting wood. Both Zorian and the Hydra simply charged through the cloud of wooden shrapnel, one with the aid of magical shields and the other through the power of supernatural toughness and regeneration. "Zack, what the hell are you doing there?" Zorian yelled. "I've been running for ages here. Did you figure out the dagger or not?" Zack, who was trailing behind both of them while occasionally making funny poses and waving the dagger in his hand at the Hydra, seemed to pause at the question. "It's hard, okay," he yelled back. "I'm running low on mana here," Zorian said. "If you don't figure it out soon, I'm calling this off." In truth, the Hydra posed very little threat to Zorian. If the situation ever got too dangerous, he could have always teleported away or simply flown away too high for the Hydra to reach. However, that would leave it free to turn around and shift its attention to Zack, which would defeat the whole purpose of this setup. The point of him leading the Hydra on the merry chase through the Gothic jungle was to give Zack the time he needed to figure out how to use the dagger on the Hydra. Something that didn't seem to be going too well. Oh well. On the bright side, if Zack couldn't figure it out by the time Zorian ran out of mana, it would be Zorian's turn next. Zorian would actually prefer if he was the one who figured out how to use the dagger, since he and Zack had agreed that whoever succeeded at this would get to own the Hydra. He had a good feeling about his chances, since, unlike Zack, he had soul perception unlocked. Surely that would. "Hydra!" Zack suddenly shouted, dramatically pointing the dagger in the monster's direction. "I am your master now. Kneel before me." No less than 3 of the Hydra's head glanced towards Zack, giving him a hateful, contemptuous look before returning their attention to Zorian again. Before Zorian could say anything, Zack suddenly teleported right on top of the Hydra and plunged the dagger straight into its back. Zorian wanted to scream at his fellow time traveler for being such an idiot. Not only had Zack exposed himself to incredible danger, since the Hydra's heads could twist backwards to reach people foolish enough to climb on its back with incredible speed and ease, the boy had also invalidated all the effort Zorian invested into making sure the Hydra was focused on him and him alone. Even if Zack got away from this stunt completely unscathed, and he probably would, in all honesty the Hydra would no longer ignore him from this point onward. Indeed, the moment Zack popped into existence on top of the Hydra's back, before he even finished plunging the dagger into its flesh, the monster was already stopping its charge, all 8 of its heads refocusing on this sudden new threat. However, the moment the dagger sank into its back, a strange thing happened. Instead of simply ignoring the puny wound and biting down on Zack anyway, the Hydra suddenly stiffened as if paralyzed. Its many heads froze in the air, jaws still stretched wide for a lethal bite, staring at Zack with confused, uncomprehending eyes. "No way," Zorian complained weakly. "Ha ha." Zack laughed, wrenching the dagger out of the wound and quickly straightening himself up. The Hydra's back not being the most stable of grounds, he almost lost his balance upon doing that and had to spend several seconds to stabilize himself. The Hydra remained completely motionless throughout all of that. Zack slapped the closest Hydra head a few times playfully. "What did I tell you, eh? I really am your master now. Kneel." The command seemed to break the Hydra out of its paralysis. Without hesitation, it dropped to the ground. Being a quadrupedal life form, it couldn't really exactly kneel as such, so it instead just dropped on its stomach and lowered its many heads on the ground. The sudden motion completely unbalanced Zack, however, sending him tumbling down the creature's back with a strangled cry. He hit the ground with a dull thud, landing on one of the exposed rocks, and then spent the next minute and a half rolling around in pain on the ground. Zorian eyed the Hydra for a few seconds before deciding not to approach for now. It was no longer attacking him, but he had a feeling that might change if he made any moves towards its new master. There is no way that was the correct command phrase to activate the dagger, is it? He eventually asked. Ugh. Damn, this hurt, said Zack, laboriously rising to his feet while using the nearby Hydra as a stabilizer. He did his best to dust himself off and get rid of the branches and bugs stuck in his hair. And no, that wasn't the command phrase. The way to activate the dagger is to first cut yourself with it to establish resonance and then cut the Hydra to forge a bond with it and finalize the deal. Zorian gave him a curious look. How the hell did you figure that out? Accidentally cut myself with it while trying to mess around with it while running, Zack admitted with an awkward laugh. He turned towards the Hydra, whose many eyes diligently followed his every move. Anyway, who cares about that? It doesn't matter how I discovered the dagger's usage, all that matters is that the Hydra is finally mine. Well, ours, but you know. Yeah, I know, Zorian said, clacking his tongue. He'd normally be annoyed about losing a bet like that, but it was probably better this way. There was no guarantee he would have uncovered such a curious method of activation himself. He felt the Hydra's mind a little. He kind of expected to find the Hydra resentful of being effectively enslaved like this, but he found the creature to be mostly curious instead. Confused and a little scared too, but mostly just curious. It did not seem to harbor any ill will towards Zack. Zorian had never heard of a monster control method that was that thorough and effective, and the Hydra should be highly resistant to mind control due to its unique mind anyway. He had a feeling this was more than just control in some strange way. The Hydra was conditioned to regard the bond forged by the dagger as innately legitimate and did not struggle against its bindings at all. Zorian was torn between being impressed by the maker of the dagger for pulling it off and disturbed that such a thing was possible. In any case, the friendliness was only towards Zack. The moment Zorian tried to step closer, the Hydra immediately jumped to its feet and interposed itself between Zorian and its master, hissing and snapping its jaws at him menacingly. Oh come on, Zorian complained. That guy doesn't need your protection from me. If anything, I would need to be protected against him if we seriously fought. The Hydra didn't understand human speech, and probably wouldn't have listened to him even if it did. It was about to lunge at Zorian when Zack placed his hand on its flank and stopped it. Hey, knock it off, Zack said. That guy is our friend, okay? No eating friends. It took a few gestures and shouting before the Hydra managed to understand what its new owner was telling it, at which point it gave Zack something reminiscent of an incredulous look, as if unable to believe Zack would be friendly to someone like Zorian, who had led it on a wild goose chase for a better part of an hour. I know he can be very annoying, but he's very useful and mostly means well, Zack said sagely, patting the Hydra gently on the flank. The Hydra directed one last unhappy hiss in Zorian's direction before grudgingly standing down and indicating it would allow him to get close without attacking him. Possibly. Zorian folded his hands over his chest and gave Zack an unamused look. Don't worry, I'm sure she'll warm up to you in time, Zack told him, grinning widely. Princess is just a little shy. What? What? Zorian blurted out. It's a she, Zack said, nodding sagely. I know, I was a little surprised myself when I felt that through the link and... No, not that. Zorian snapped. You're seriously naming a Hydra princess? Why not? Zack challenged. What's wrong with that name? The newly named princess focused three of her heads on him, as if daring him to say anything. Stupid reptile. It didn't even understand what they were talking about but felt the need to side with Zack anyway. It's a stupid name, Zorian told him bluntly. It's a great name, Zack disagreed. A royal name for a very royal girl. She's a divinely empowered guardian of an imperial item that's pretty high-ranked if you ask me. Plus, you know how royals like to refer to themselves in plural. We this and we that well, Princess here can talk about herself in plural and be completely factual. So there. It's actually very clever and you were just too judgmental to figure it out. Ugh, Zorian grunted. If that's your logic, why not call her Queen instead? Because Princess is a more ironic name for a giant hydra, Zack admitted. Zorian spent the next 15 minutes trying to argue the issue before giving up. It took another hour after that to coax Princess back into the Imperial Orb for transport. She wanted to follow around after Zack like a puppy, and was confused why he wanted to abandon her in the orb so soon after their bonding. Zorian had to say, watching Zack awkwardly try to convince a clingy hydra that he would be back and that she should stay put was kind of amusing. Perhaps it was a good thing that Zack ended up winning that bet after all. After recovering the Imperial Orb and tentatively subduing the hydra guarding it, Zack and Zorian turned their attention towards the Solrotham at the Ziggurat of the Sun and the Imperial Ring in their possession. They already knew they could steal their ring if they launched a big enough attack on them, but that took a great deal of time and effort. Well, the presence of Princess on the battlefield would probably make an all-out assault a little easier this time around, but it would still be a major undertaking that would consume a lot of their time and resources that would be better spent elsewhere. It's a pity Princess is too big to fit in the ziggurat corridors, lamented Zack. Otherwise we could just climb on top of her and charge in, trampling and brushing aside any Solrotham that got in our way. If our attack was that unstoppable, the Solrotham would probably just pick up whatever they can and flee, pointed out Zorian. They'd probably flee underground, and it would be an utter pain to track them down then. Not to mention they have a massive sandworm on their side. We don't want to get in an underground battle with them, I think, even with Princess on our side. Humph, Zack mumbled unhappily. How about we just infiltrate the ziggurat through this underground connection, then? We might be able to avoid a massive battle that way. They have their pet sandworm constantly guarding that, Zorian pointed out, shaking his head sadly. I bet we're noticed instantly through whatever exotic senses that thing has, and then it collapses the whole tunnel on top of us before we can do anything. Considering the layout of their dungeon entrance, I think it was made by the worm in the first place, so they probably have no qualms about destroying it. They can always command the sandworm to create another one later. Zack was silent for a while. How about just soul-killing the entire colony? Zack finally asked. I mean, it makes me a little uncomfortable to use tactics like that, but this is pretty much what the damn knife was made for. It's definitely an option, Zorian said after a short pause. However, we probably wouldn't be able to get all Solrotham with this, and we don't know how many of them know about the ring and its importance. If we kill most of the colony but one of the survivors takes the ring and runs, things could get really bad. Right now we know where the ring is. If a shattered group of Solrotham survivors takes the ring and spends a day or two running around in the desert or, gods forbid, the depths of the dungeon. Yeah, you're right, Zack said. It's too risky. Even if we get them all, there are neighboring Solrotham tribes and other denizens of the desert to consider. If they discover the state of the ziggurat and loot the ring before we reach it, we would still have a problem on our hands. Speaking of the neighboring Solrotham tribes, do we still go forward with the idea of arranging an alliance with them? Zorian asked. The idea is nice, I admit, but it may very well take more time and effort to do it that way than to just send our own army at the ziggurat. Not if we use Princess. Zack declared triumphantly. You want to use the damn Hydra for everything these days, Zorian scoffed. You're like a little kid who just got himself a new toy and now wants to show it to everyone. How the hell will that thing help us convince the Solrotham faster? There is no need to be jealous, Zorian, Zack chided. You lost the bet fair and square. In any case, I think you greatly underestimate the impression of power we will project when we show up with a giant menacing hydra in tow. I bet those tribes will be tripping over themselves to stay on our good side after seeing that. Or they'll be too scared to even talk to us, Zorian pointed out. Then we just smash them until they're willing to listen, Zack shrugged. This is starting to sound a lot less like arranging an alliance and a lot more like us bullying the neighboring tribes into being our reluctant army, Zorian pointed out. I think of it more as an aggressive demonstration than bullying, Zack said dismissively. We would have had to prove our strength for them to take us seriously, anyway. But really, so what if we end up cowing them into submission forcefully? We're already attacking the Ziggurat tribe without any provocation. We lost the moral high ground a long time ago, I think. True. Alright, said Zorian. Let's try to make them willing allies if possible, though. I have another task I want to give them, and they probably won't try very hard if our overwhelming force is all that keeps them in line. Oh. Something important? Zack asked. Maybe, Zorian answered. There is a magical creature called a tunnler toad, which lives deep within the Zlotic desert. They live in a series of hidden worlds left by some forgotten ancient civilization, called Ishmaeli reservoirs by the ancient Icosians, because they seem designed primarily as water reservoirs. They're basically large caverns full of water, enclosed in their own pocket dimensions. The reservoirs are largely uninteresting, but the tunnler toads themselves have a curious ability to detect pocket dimensions and enter them with ease. In their natural habitat they use this to pass in and out of the Ishmaeli reservoirs as they please, using them as a hidden nesting ground, but the ability is said to be usable on any pocket dimension they come across. Ah, I see, this is for that blood magic initiative you want to set up, Zack said. Why do you need the Solrotham's help for this, though? If the toads live only around these reservoir things, they should be easy to find. It's not like the reservoirs can move, right? They're static, but I'm afraid the records of where the reservoirs are located have all been lost in the cataclysm, and no one had bothered to track them down again as far as I can tell, Zorian said, shaking his head. With much of the interior now covered in desert and taken over by Solrotham tribes and worse, the reservoirs have become extremely isolated. Not to mention that most people are neither master dimensionalists nor tunnler toads, so they would be unable to track down and enter these hidden worlds even if they wanted to. Thus, if we want to find tunnler toads, we must find a desert native that has heard about strange toads that sometimes seemingly vanish into thin air, only to just as suddenly reappear later. Annoying, Zack remarked with a frown. Is this really necessary? We have lots of candidates for ability theft and it comes to magical creatures with relevant abilities. None of them are easy to track down, Zorian pointed out. Not only are they rare and mostly extinct near human-dominated territories, the very nature of their abilities means these creatures can hide and retreat with incredible ease. The other may very well be even more annoying to find. If you think tunnler toads are bad, wait till you hear how annoying it is to track down a phase spider without it taking the initiative to reveal itself. Right, Zack said, clacking his tongue unhappily. I guess I'll try to be a little nicer to the stupid wasps. He paused for a second. So we're really going to start dabbling in blood magic and enhancement rituals in this restart, then? Yes. Although we should start with something relatively easy and well-tested, Zorian confirmed. Eagle Eyes enhancement, for instance. Or any of the simple physical enhancements that aim to improve the user's strength, stamina, regeneration and so on. Well-known, straightforward things that are unlikely to go catastrophically wrong when attempted by beginners like us. Not really instilling me with a sense of confidence here, Zorian, Zack complained. What can I say? Zorian shrugged. Blood magic is dangerous. If it makes you feel any better, I will be going first. It does not, Zack said. We both know it will be me who has to take the biggest risks in regards to this. I have way more mana to burn on permanent enhancements and I am also proficient in medical magic, so I will be able to push my limits more and understand life force manipulation way better than you. Zorian didn't dispute him. While he had no intention of piling most of the risk on Zack, his fellow time traveler was likely right in his prediction. Don't make such a grim face, Zack said dismissively. I already agreed we should do this when we talked before, didn't I? I didn't change my mind. I kind of feel I'm pressuring you over this, Zorian admitted. I'm not that easy to pressure, Zack assured him. You've been trying to pressure me to let you inspect my mind for a long time now, for instance, and I have never let you do it. I still think that's a mistake, Zorian told him. And the answer is still no, Zack said, grinning. See? Pressure ineffective. I agreed with this creepy blood magic stuff because I honestly think you're right. We're too slow at figuring out primordial prisons. Only distasteful, unconventional methods like this can let us find a shortcut we need. Fair enough, Zorian said. Personally, he did not find blood magic to be that creepy, and even viewed it as a potentially useful tool for usage outside the time loop, but he understood where Zack was coming from. They spent 2 more hours discussing various ideas before they both entered the pocket dimension inside the Imperial Orb for a very important task. They had to convince Princess to let Zorian examine how her mind worked without trying to bite his head off for his insolence. It would prove to be a very challenging task. As days went by, some curious things began to be noticed by various countries of Koth, Zlotic and Altazia. The first one was that House Terramachula suddenly organized and launched a major expedition to Blantyr in order to find the fabled imperial staff of Icosia, sinking a massive amount of money and manpower into the endeavor. The level of support House Terramachula had given to the project was not as extensive as Daimen had hoped, but it was still major by virtually any means, and the frantic speed with which the whole thing was organized and executed was enough to give others pause. The Terramachula seemed almost desperate to track down the staff, and nobody could figure out why. The leadership of the house declined to answer any questions regarding the matter, contributing to the air of mystery. More importantly, the Terramachula displayed the ability to open cross-continental dimensional passages between their land and their base in Blantyr. This was not something Zack and Zorian wanted to make known, but proved to be utterly impossible to hide, given the scale of the operation. This information soon spread around like a wildfire throughout various spy agencies, especially ones based in Koth, who were immediately consumed by an intense desire to know everything possible about the situation. Amusingly, this included trying to track down information about the Imperial staff. They thought the Imperial artifacts were just historical curiosities, but since the Terramachula wanted the staff so badly, there had to be something special about it. Many people suddenly wanted to get their hands on the Imperial staff, or at least hoped to understand what sort of power their rivals would possess should they successfully claim the item. Zack and Zorian intended to steal the results of all such research near the end of the restart. Who knows, maybe the combined might of all these spy agencies would find something they had overlooked. The second thing that got people's attention, especially in Altazia, was intricate spell formula schematics, alchemical recipes, new spell compendiums and sensitive spy reports that started to surface all over the continent. Nobody knew who was responsible for this, how they had come up with all this in complete secrecy, or what their motives were, and it was completely unknown just how many people had received this assistance, considering many people had simply accepted their gifts quietly and set out to exploit them in secret. Finally, the gifts seemed to be most heavily concentrated in Eldamar, which was a huge concern for everyone around them. This caused a frenzy of speculation and activity across the continent, as people tried to figure out what this meant and how to hopefully take advantage of it. This was, of course, done by Zack and Zorian. They did it for a very simple reason, to muddy the waters and prevent their newly marked fellow time travelers from standing out too much. It was too much to expect all of them to behave themselves at all times or never make a blunder, especially in this first restart while they were still under heavy impression of their first repeat of the month. Introducing enough waves into their surroundings would hopefully keep most people too busy with other matters to pay attention to crazy stories of time-traveling academy professors and the like. Thus far, the idea seemed to be working, but it would remain to be seen if that would hold out until the end. This done, Zack and Zorian turned their attention to organizing the search for the Imperial staff in Blantyre. While the bulk of the job was done by Daimen and his men, it was a necessity for Zack and Zorian to get regularly involved. For one thing, the descriptions of the Imperial staff were vague and contradictory, so they were the only ones that could identify the staff with any degree of certainty, thanks to their ability to sense the presence of the key. Additionally, they were necessary for transporting people and supplies all over Blantyre, since they were the only ones that could easily open dimensional gates from one location to another. Zorian had been quietly hoping that the immense amount of resources they had mobilized in the search would provide quick results, but his hopes were soon dashed upon the rocks of reality. Finding the staff turned out to be much, much harder than finding a Bakura gate. The gates were rare and obscure, but fairly distinctive. The staff, on the other hand, was something incredibly common in Blantyre. The lizard men loved their staves. They were a popular symbol of authority, and virtually any lizardman ruler and priest had a staff to call their own. While this meant that the imperial staff probably hadn't been thrown away and forgotten in some ancient treasury, it also meant that tracking it down was akin to searching for a needle in a haystack. The one saving grace was that the imperial staff was free of most decorations, being just a plain piece of dark wood, whereas the lizard men liked to decorate their own staves with gems and feathers and whatnot. Then again, what was to stop the new owner from adding those things to the imperial staff to pretty it up? Ugh. Influenced by such things, Zack and Zorian decided to approach Quatakikl for lessons again. Originally they wondered if they should skip their interaction with him in this particular restart, due to all the new time loopers suddenly walking around, but in the end they decided they would risk it. This time, the topic they chose was tracking magic and search spells. This was a relatively safe topic to ask about, and it might help them find the staff faster. A foolish hope, probably, considering the staff was immune to normal divination, just like all the other imperial artifacts. However, Quatakikl was familiar with divine energies in a way that others couldn't match, so perhaps he knew of a way it could be done. The topic was also potentially useful in tracking down Red Robe once they were outside the time loop, and it might give them an answer about how Quatakikl had managed to detect their presence at the end of the previous restart. Zorian really wanted an answer to that last question, since he had thought his privacy wards were pretty much flawless at this point. It was really unfortunate that he had been unable to find out anything of worth when he broke through Quatakikl's mental defenses, Zorian thought gloomily. While he was extremely proficient at performing memory probes by now, that type of magic took a long time to really get going, and the ancient Lich had given him very little time to work with before abandoning his body. He probably shouldn't have tried to find out where Quatakikl's phylactery was located. That kind of information was incredibly important and was thus bound to be guarded with the greatest possible zeal. He should have gone for something fairly mundane. Maybe Quatakikl would have been willing to risk things and spend more time struggling against his mental probe. At the moment, though, Zack and Zorian were in the time magic research facility beneath Cyoria. The two of them were disguised as adult agents of the Crown, and were having a private talk with Cranton Keklos, the head researcher and overseer of the facility. Cranton was slowly turning the Imperial Orb in his hands, utterly fascinated with it. "You understand that we require your complete silence about this matter, don't you, Mr. Keklos?" Zorian asked him. The man suddenly looked up, a slightly confused look on his face. He had evidently been so absorbed in his study of the orb that he had lost track of time. Oh. Oh yes, I absolutely understand the need for secrecy, Cranton quickly said, nodding furiously. I assure you, me and my team are quite used to working on top-secret projects and dealing with potential leaks. He took another long look at the orb in his hands. This thing, it's absolutely amazing, he said, obvious admiration in his voice. I cannot put into words how glad I am to be given this honor. I hope you remember you are not being given this orb just to satisfy your personal curiosity, Zack said gruffly. He was playing the bad guy in their fake royal agent scheme. We have given you this honor because you are our nation's foremost expert on black rooms, and we hope you can turn this pocket dimension into the largest one yet. Can you do it or not? Yes, absolutely, Cranton said. While the volume of space inside is larger than anything we have ever done, the isolation from the outside world is also unprecedented. We can definitely turn this into a temporal dilation zone. Just? Zorian prompted. This is a very ambitious undertaking you are proposing here, Cranton said, stumbling over the word slightly. Zorian could feel that, although Cranton was a little nervous, he was also determined to make the absolute most out of this opportunity he was presented with. To create this thing you are proposing, we would have to considerably expand the research facility and design whole new methods of black room construction. While I am sure we can do it eventually, the amount of time involved is not small. We are a very small team and... You want more money, Zack said bluntly, cutting him off. And people, Cranton nodded. He seemed to sense this was important to them. In that case, he felt it was entirely appropriate to ask for increased commitment in terms of resources and available staff. Zorian did not answer verbally. He just reached into his jacket and handed Cranton a promissory note from one of the local banks. He could have brought actual cash too, of course, but he knew by now that government facilities like this rarely dealt with such things and that dumping large stacks of paper money on them would be a huge mistake. It would raise all sorts of red flags in their heads. Cranton wordlessly accepted the promissory note and glanced at it. He raised his eyebrow at the number printed on it. Zorian could tell he was appreciative, but not really impressed. This is just the initial sum to get you started, of course, Zorian said. You will get further funding once things actually start moving forward, as well as additional bonuses if the project is going particularly well. Of course, Cranton said, slightly more impressed. In regards to additional staff, that is a bit more complex, Zorian said. Due to the somewhat abrupt nature of this initiative, it will take at least a month before we can send some new people here on a permanent basis. That's fine, Cranton said easily. I can wait a month or several. Just be aware that the longer it takes for additional manpower to arrive, the more the project will stall. I wasn't finished, Zorian said, shaking his head. Although we cannot send people here officially, you will get several mages skilled in dimensionalism to help you move faster with the project. Specifically, the man would be getting Svim, Silverlake, Zack and Zorian. With their expertise in dimensionalism and with the research facility staff's experience in constructing black rooms, the project would hopefully result in something useful after a few restarts. Cranton didn't seem to like the idea, however. I don't like experts outside my authority coming here, telling me how to run things, he told them bluntly. Even if they're highly capable, they don't know the wider context of why we do things the way we do. They would just slow things down and create confusion. Are you the facility overseer or not? Zack challenged. Are you telling me that you cannot keep a couple of new arrivals in line or bring them up to speed in a timely manner? Cranton frowned at him, giving him a slightly angry look. These people are being sent here as help, Zorian said in a conciliatory tone. If, after talking to them, you feel they contribute nothing of worth to the project, you are free to send them away. Just remember that their help has already been factored into our projections on how long the project will take, Zack warned. Very well, Cranton said, a little unhappily. I shall give these people a chance, at least. We will see if they are as good as you say they are. It took them another hour to arrange everything. Zack and Zorian handed Cranton a whole stack of official documentation, which the man merely glanced at before handing it over to the rest of his staff. He evidently didn't even consider the idea that this was all just an elaborate ruse. Zorian hoped the people actually in charge of processing the documentation would be every bit as careless as their overseer, because many of the documents wouldn't stand up to detailed scrutiny. Well, Cranton eventually breathed out. This has certainly been a productive evening. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about? Actually, yes, Zorian nodded, handing the man another folder full of documents. There's been a change in regards to the group that is planned to take advantage of the next Black Room period. This wasn't how Zack and Zorian usually took over the Black Room beneath Cyoria when they wanted to use it. Normally they just disabled the true group and then showed up with bogus documents at the last possible moment, giving the facility staff little time to consider the issue. This time, however, they planned to bring an entire group with them. Thus, they had taken time to arrange things a little more thoroughly. Oh. The Reddens group decided to cancel their scheduled Black Room use? Cranton said, skimming through the folder. Strange, they were all so enthusiastic about the whole thing. He gave them a knowing look. He clearly knew there was some foul play involved here, but he probably thought it was the government bullying a group into dropping their claim rather than some kind of deception. He shook his head sadly, throwing the folder to the side. I'm curious, he said. This orb, the sudden changes in resource allocations and the like, are they related to these mysterious gifts I keep hearing about through the rumor mill? Ha! We aren't paid to ask those kind of questions, and neither are you, Zack told him grimly. But probably, added Zorian. Zack gave him a warning look in response. He was a pretty good actor, all things considered. Did he used to do this sort of thing a lot during past restarts, or was he just a natural? Alright, I understand. Forget I asked, Cranton said, rising from his seat. I guess we should both get back to our jobs. When can I expect these experts of yours? 3 days from now, Zorian said. That should be enough to see if their ruse worked or not. We will also periodically drop by to check your progress and see if you need anything. Give me sufficient resources and I'll give you what you want, Cranton assured them. Zorian had no doubt about that. The real question was whether the results would come fast enough to be of any use. He also swore mentally that if Cranton really produced impressive results with what they've given him, he would find a way to reward him for it in the real world. Somehow. In a typical restart, Zack and Zorian had a habit of holding meetings in all sorts of different places: parks, taverns, abandoned houses, houses under construction, tiny caves in the middle of the wilderness. They usually made a choice based on pure impulse and convenience. The novelty of holding a meeting in a new location was also a welcome reprieve from the soul-crushing sameness that dominated the time loop. Now, however, they had a lot more people participating in these kinds of meetings. This completely changed their usual dynamic. They couldn't decide these kinds of things on a whim anymore. They now had to find a space big enough to hold all of them in relative comfort and make sure everyone could gather there in a timely manner. Public places were pretty much out of consideration. A group of a dozen people of a variety of ages and occupations, plus some giant spiders, would turn heads wherever they went. Additionally, Ilsa got angry at them when they tried to arrange for a meeting in a cold, damp cave in the middle of uninhabited wilderness. Zorian didn't understand what the big deal was. The centipede that tried to climb up her leg was less than a finger thick and the bats didn't bother anyone, but afterwards everyone agreed to only hold meetings in actual buildings. Thus, the two of them eventually decided to just hold all the meetings at the Novita estate. The place had plenty of empty, spacious rooms and very good privacy wards already in place. Though Zack complained that was the boring choice, he agreed with Zorian that organizing meetings elsewhere was more trouble than it was worth. Thus, at this moment, there was a huge group of people gathered in one of the larger meeting rooms in the Novita estate. The actual meeting was already over by this point, but the group had not disbanded for the day. Instead, they had mostly broken up into smaller groups that discussed things of mutual interest between themselves. In one corner, the emissary from the filigree sages was having a loud and enthusiastic discussion with Norabul. The female spell formula teacher did not seem to mind that she was talking to a giant spider and instead relished the chance to discuss her field of study with a kindred soul. The filigree sage's emissary, meanwhile, seemed immensely pleased to have found a human mage that was interested in their brand of spell formula. The two of them seemed completely oblivious to their surroundings and the passage of time, so consumed they were in their discussion. Not far from them, Alanik and Kiran had covered a table full of various maps and were staring at it in silence. Every once in a while they would point at a random spot on the map and speak a few curt words at each other before falling silent again. Zorian couldn't figure out anything from their brief, mysterious exchanges. In all likelihood, neither could anyone else. Everyone seemed to be giving them a wide berth. In the other corner, Zack was having a loud discussion with the emissary from the Luminous Advocates. This one was less friendly than the one between Nora Boole and the Filigree Sage's emissary, though. Zack seemed to be trying to convince the Luminous Advocates to tutor him in mind magic, while the emissary was stubbornly pointing out that Zack wasn't psychic and that this would be a waste of time. Zorian suspected Zack would get his way in the end. Luminous Advocates were a lot less prideful with them after experiencing the time loop in person, and they now knew exactly how powerful Zack was. They knew they couldn't afford to piss him off, and Zack was unlikely to quit once he set his mind on something, so they would probably cave in eventually. Whether anything would come out of such a lesson was something Zorian was a lot less sure about. Not too far from them, a small group consisting of Kale, Taven, Lukav and Daimen was sorting through the various rare materials Zack and Zorian gathered and exchanging stories. The talk seemed to be pretty mundane, focusing on amusing anecdotes and such. One of the tables was completely monopolized by Silverlake, poring over their documents related to their study of the Abasin Gate. Zorian was pretty surprised at her behavior in this restart, in all honesty. She seemed far more enthusiastic and open about helping them now. It was interesting how dramatically she changed once she experienced the time loop with her own eyes. Finally, there was Zorian. Like Silverlake, he wasn't really interacting with anyone at the moment. Instead, he was inspecting a table full of divine artifacts that they had stolen for study. He had never made any progress in figuring out these things, but he certainly wasn't about to give up. Especially since Quadakikl had given them definite confirmation that it was possible to at least detect divine energies with regular magic. Eventually his solitude was broken by Svim, who walked up to his table and sat down on the chair next to him. He looked faintly displeased. "Problems?" Zorian asked. "I have a newfound appreciation for the amount of patience you and Mr. Novita possess," he said blandly. "I've just spent the entire morning marking down a stack of student homework that was absolutely identical to what I had already done in the previous restart and realized this would happen a lot." An unpleasant realization. "Ha," Zorian said. "You can always just ignore it." Svim shook his head. "That would go against my professional pride," he said. "Just as I demand dedication from my students, I demand the same from myself. A little thing like this should not break me. I shall treat it as personal tempering, I suppose." "I see," Zorian said, nodding. "I suppose you'd be quite a hypocrite if, after subjecting your students to such an infuriating initial treatment, you ended up losing your patience after only a handful of repeating months." Svim hummed in response, not giving a verbal response. He glanced at the divine artifacts Zorian was inspecting. "You realize, I'm sure, that no one has ever managed to figure out how divine artifacts actually work?" Svim asked. "Of course," Zorian said. "But very few people had the opportunity to take one apart over and over again as a method of study." "Still, I'm surprised you're wasting time on this," Svim remarked. "Wouldn't it be wiser to spend more time on time loop related things?" "I would actually classify this as very much a time loop related thing," Zorian answered. "The time loop clearly works at least partially with the help of divine energies. Who's to say they aren't involved with our markers?" "Oh?" Svim asked, suddenly more interested. "It's just baseless speculation," Zorian said. "But I've been thinking about what Red Robe could possibly have that other past controllers didn't that would allow him to break the limitations placed on temporary markers, and the most likely answer I've come up with is Quadakikl." I suspect divine energies are involved with the marker somehow, and that the reason Red Robe had been able to alter it is because he had Quatakikle's help. His method of perceiving and possibly modifying divine energies may have allowed him to tamper with the marker in ways that are impossible to us, in which case our efforts to understand and modify the marker are doomed to fail right from the very start. I hope you are not right about that, Svim said after a short pause. Quatakikle has been alive for centuries. Who knows how long it took him to develop such capabilities? Zorian had nothing to say to that.